take a slow, deep breath and let your thoughts begin to drift. Tonight we're going back in time, not to the stories you've heard before, but to the ones that rarely get told. No loud explosions, no fast battles, just quiet corners of World War II history, uncovered softly, gently, one by one. These are the overlooked moments, the small human echoes inside a massive war, stories of courage, sorrow, and silence. Some happened in hidden forests, others in distant villages. Some changed lives, others simply faded, until now. You don't need to remember them all, just let them carry you into sleep. The pianist who played through the fire. There are some stories that don't begin with action. They begin with silence, with stillness, with the sound of breathing in a broken room. This one begins in Warsaw, in the shadow of destruction, sometime in late 1944. The city had been torn apart, not just by bombs and bullets, but by years of occupation, of resistance, of suffering carved deep into every wall and window. Where once there were boulevards filled with voices, now there were empty streets littered with brick dust and memories. Most buildings had been reduced to hollow shells. Fires had swept through whole districts. The ghetto was gone. The uprising had failed. And yet, in one apartment, somehow still standing, a single piano remained. It wasn't a grand piano anymore. Its polish was dulled, its edges scorched, its legs wobbling just slightly on a fractured floor. Dust covered the keys. Some were cracked, a few didn't work. And yet, it was a piano. And it had not been silenced. Inside this apartment, hiding in the ruins, was a man who had once played for crowds. His name was Władysław Szpilman. Before the war, he had been a concert pianist, a rising star in Poland, known for his precision, his emotion, the way his hands could turn a familiar melody into something brand new. But the war had erased stages, silenced orchestras, and turned artists into ghosts. He had survived the ghetto, narrowly escaped the deportations. He had lost his family, his home, nearly his name. He had hidden in basements, wandered the streets, and somehow, through luck and help and unthinkable endurance, ended up in this one burned-out apartment, alone. He hadn't played in months. His fingers had grown thin, his wrists stiff. He had barely spoken. But now, with the building quiet and the war rumbling in the distance, he sat before the keys, and he began to play. He didn't know who could hear him. Maybe no one. Maybe someone dangerous. Maybe a soldier. But he played anyway. Not loudly. Not triumphantly. Just gently. Just enough for the music to exist. It was a piece by Chopin, something he'd memorized long before the world changed. His hands remembered it better than he did. They floated above the keys, reconnecting with something that felt human. Something that wasn't fear. For the first time in a long time, his fingers did not tremble from cold or hunger. They moved with purpose. The notes weren't perfect. Some keys stuck. Others clicked slightly out of tune. But none of that mattered. Because in that moment, music returned to the ruins. And so did memory. So did feeling. So did the reminder that even in a city stripped bare, something beautiful could still exist. Something gentle. Something without orders or uniforms or flags. Just music, raw and unspoken. He kept playing, not for applause, not for survival, but for breath, for stillness, for the truth that if he could make music again, he had not been destroyed completely. That something inside him still remained. He didn't know then that this moment would be remembered. That years later, his story would be written down, shared, adapted, even filmed. That generations would hear this and pause. That others, drifting off to sleep decades later, might imagine the sound of those broken piano notes echoing through shattered Warsaw. He wasn't playing for them. He was playing because in a world gone silent, music felt like defiance. And maybe that's what makes this story linger. Not the scale of it, not the fame that would follow, but the intimacy of it. One man, one piano, one night. No witnesses, no lights, no announcement. Just the quiet resistance of beauty, kept alive in a place where everything else had been taken. He could have stayed silent, but he chose not to. And that was the sound of survival, the soldier who carried a child. The story doesn't begin in glory. It doesn't start with medals or flags or grand speeches. It begins with rain, with mud, with boots soaked through, and sky the colour of ash. It begins on a slope outside Monte Cassino, Italy. A hill that had been bombed so many times it no longer looked like a hill at all, but more like a skeleton of stone, broken and scorched. The Allies had been trying to take it for months. German soldiers held the high ground, and for every advance there was resistance. For every inch gained, there was a cost. Beneath the monastery ruins at the top, soldiers from many nations trudged upward. British, American, New Zealander, Moroccan, Indian, and Polish. Among them was a young Polish infantryman. We don't know his name. Maybe he never told anyone. He wasn't a commander. He didn't lead charges or operate tanks. He just carried his rifle, followed orders, kept moving through the mud like so many others. The battlefield was chaos, explosions in the distance, shouts over the radio, medics pulling wounded men from the debris. But in the middle of it all, something unexpected happened. He heard a sound that didn't belong, a sound quieter than the rest, softer, fragile. It was a child crying. He paused. The others kept moving. The mission pressed forward, but the sound didn't stop. It came from behind a pile of shattered brick near what had once been a home, or maybe a school. And there, in the dust and ruin, he found her. A girl, maybe 4 years old, alone, barefoot, her face smudged with ash, her dress torn, her hands trembling in the cold. She didn't speak. She just looked up at him, eyes too wide for her age. Her family was gone. Her house was gone. The war had taken everything from her, except the sound of her own tears. He looked at her, then at the path ahead. He could have shouted for help, could have moved on, but instead, he set down his rifle. He took off his coat, and he wrapped it gently around her shoulders. He knelt low, lifted her into his arms, and began walking. Not quickly, not heroically, just steadily, through the battlefield, through mud, through gunfire echoing in the distance. She clung to his neck, silent now, her face against his collarbone, and he carried her. For 3 days. He gave her half his rations, shared his water. At night, he slept sitting up so she wouldn't lie on the ground. He tucked her coat tighter when the winds picked up. He didn't speak her language. She didn't speak his, but it didn't matter. Every time he looked into her eyes, she looked back, not with fear anymore, but with something like belief. Eventually, he reached a field hospital. He handed her over to a nurse, stayed only long enough to make sure she was fed and warm, and then walked away. Back toward the sound of artillery, back toward the mountain. He didn't stay for thanks. He didn't leave his name, just a coat and a memory. Years passed. The war ended. Peace came. And that little girl, who had no idea who he was or where he came from, grew up. She remembered his face only faintly, but she never forgot the arms that held her, the coat that wrapped her, or the silence of those nights when all she heard was his breathing beside hers. Not every act of heroism comes with a headline. Some come without words, without witnesses. Just one soldier, and a child too small to understand why she had survived, but old enough to know that someone, somewhere, had carried her through the fire. The train that never reached Auschwitz. There were many trains during the Second World War. Too many. Their wheels carried silence and fear. Their compartments were dark, crowded, filled with people who had no idea where they were going, only that they were not coming back. One of those trains left Budapest in 1944. It was filled with Hungarian Jews, entire families, some young, some old, all ordered onto the cars by men in uniform who gave no explanations. They had heard the rumors. Everyone had. The name Auschwitz was whispered like a curse. It wasn't just a place. It was an ending. The train began to move. Slowly at first, then faster. The iron tracks ran north. It was the middle of summer, but the air felt cold. People sat or stood pressed together in the wooden cars, too cramped to lie down, too afraid to speak. Some cried, others prayed. Some sat perfectly still, their eyes open, not blinking, as if they had already left. But this train did something strange. After several hours of travel, it stopped, not in a station, not near any visible town, just on the tracks. The engine hissed, the doors stayed closed. Then, without warning, the guards vanished. They left. One moment they were shouting. The next there was nothing but the sound of insects outside the wooden slats and the faint creaking of wood. Confusion spread through the train. Whispers, then louder questions, but no one moved. It might have been a trick. It often was. And then, as the sun began to lower, a man appeared, not in a soldier's uniform, but in a suit. Tall, quiet, composed. His name was Karl Lutz, a Swiss diplomat. Not a soldier, not a general. Just a man with papers in his hand. Documents, permissions. He had negotiated with Nazi officials in Budapest, using a tangle of neutral status and diplomatic arrangements to create something fragile and rare. An opening. A chance. The train, he explained, would not continue. The passengers were to be rerouted, protected, saved. It didn't make sense. It didn't seem possible. But it happened. Lutz had spent months forging and issuing thousands of letters of protection, carefully wording them to stay just within the narrow rules allowed by neutrality. He bribed officials, argued with police, risked everything, and on that day, it worked. He intercepted the transport. He diverted the train. More than 1,600 people were saved. That train never reached Auschwitz. They were taken instead to safe zones in Budapest, temporary havens shielded by foreign flags and diplomatic loopholes. And there, many survived until the end of the war. They lived. Because someone stopped a train. Because someone used words instead of weapons. Because one man chose, quietly, to interfere. After the war, Karl Lutz didn't speak loudly about what he'd done. He returned to Switzerland, quietly criticized by some for having bent the rules too far, but others began to understand. Decades later, he would be honored for what he had done, for what he had prevented, not with statues or songs, but with the memory of one train that didn't arrive. And maybe that's the power of this story. It isn't about the train that was taken, but the one that wasn't. It's about the lives that could have vanished, but didn't. About a moment when bureaucracy bent toward mercy, when ink on paper became stronger than steel, and when silence, for once, was broken in the right direction. They say history moves like a train, but sometimes it stops. And if someone's waiting, it can change everything. The pigeon that saved a village. Not every hero in war wears a uniform. Not every messenger has a voice. And not every rescue begins with a plan. Some begin in a cage, with feathers and instinct, and the strange trust that something fragile might carry something vital. Her name was Chère Amie, French for dear friend. She weighed less than a pound. She couldn't speak, couldn't fire a weapon, couldn't follow orders, but she could fly. And in October of 1918, in the final weeks of World War I, not World War II, but the war before it, that was enough to save over 190 lives. She was one of hundreds of pigeons used by the US Army Signal Corps, trained to deliver messages across battlefields when radios failed, when wires were cut, when runners never returned. These birds weren't pets. They were communications. Quiet, tireless links between the front and safety. Carried in cages strapped to soldiers' packs, released in moments of desperation. Most didn't make it, but Cher Ami did. The story begins in the Argonne forest, dense, tangled, unforgiving. An American battalion had pushed too far forward, surrounded now by German forces. The trees above were thick. The maps were wrong. No food, no water. Worst of all, friendly fire had begun to fall from their own side, shelling their position from a distance, unaware of who was down below. The soldiers were trapped. If something didn't change soon, they would be wiped out by accident. 3 pigeons were released that day, each carrying the same desperate message. One was shot down immediately. Another disappeared. Cher Ami was the last. She took off, rising through the smoke, her small form dodging bullets, wind, branches. But almost immediately, she was struck. A bullet tore through her chest. One leg was nearly gone, her feathers matted with blood, but she kept flying. 25 miles through the storm of war. She flew for 30 minutes with a wound that should have stopped her instantly. When she landed, she collapsed, her message still attached by a thread to the remnants of her leg. The note was read. The shelling stopped. The battalion was found. And nearly 200 men, who had already prepared to die, were saved. Because of a pigeon. Because of one last message. Cher Ami didn't live much longer. Her injuries were too great. But she survived long enough to be recognized, to be carried home, to receive a medal from the French government, and to be remembered not just as a bird, but as a symbol. And while this story is from the war before, it echoes into the second. Because even in World War II, pigeons were used again. Thousands of them, flown from submarines, dropped with paratroopers, carried in cages across enemy lines. They flew through gunfire, storms and smoke, often the only way to get a message through. One pigeon was credited with saving an entire British village from a bombing raid. Another helped locate a stranded patrol in Burma. Again and again, these small lives carried something larger than themselves. In a war defined by machines and bombs, sometimes it was wings that mattered most. Not loud, not powerful, but persistent, determined, honest. Cher Ami is still remembered. Her body was preserved and displayed at the Smithsonian. But her legacy doesn't need a glass case. It lives in the idea that sometimes something as small as a bird can change the course of a day, or a life, or a war. Because heroes come in all shapes, some with medals, some with feathers, some with one leg and a final flight. Rain, cigarettes, and a Christmas truce. It had been raining for days, not the kind of rain that passes, but the slow, soaking kind that turns everything into mud, that makes your uniform heavy and your fingers stiff and your boots feel like stone. It was December 1940. The war in Europe had taken on its next form. The Maginot Line, that long, fortified border between France and Germany, had become a quiet standoff, with soldiers dug into opposite sides of an invisible line. They watched. They waited. But for weeks, neither side moved. In this grey space between silence and war, soldiers passed their days under canvas tarps, eating dry rations, scribbling letters, listening for the rumble of tanks that never came. The French were stationed on one side of the forest, the Germans on the other, and in between, only mist. No man's land stretched out in the fog, broken only by tree stumps, wire, and the occasional fallen helmet. It was Christmas Eve when something different happened. There was no declaration, no plan, no officer gave the order. But as evening fell and the rain finally stopped, a voice rang out from the German side. Not a shout, not a command, a song, a quiet, familiar melody, one that floated easily through the cold air. The French soldiers paused. They listened. A few recognized the tune. Some even mouthed the words. Then one of them began to sing in return. A different language, but the same song. It wasn't loud. It wasn't organized. Just voices, scattered, cautious, real. And then, without warning, something crossed the field. A small bundle, thrown not hard but gently. It landed just short of the French trench. A soldier crawled out, retrieved it. Inside, a pack of cigarettes, half full, nothing more. The French responded in kind. A chocolate bar, tossed low and slow. No sudden movements, no guns lifted, just small offerings. Not a truce by treaty, a truce by instinct. That night, some men stayed up late. They didn't sleep. They sat along the edge of their trench, lighting cigarettes they hadn't rolled, tasting chocolate they hadn't seen in months. A few exchanged names, shouted across the space like echoes. No one fired. No one advanced. They just stopped. And in that stop, something human returned. For just a few hours. There have been other stories like this. Most famously in 1914 during the First World War, when British and German troops met between the trenches to share food, stories, even a football match. But this version, in 1940, is quieter. There were no photographs, no records. Just memories carried home by men who didn't know if they would survive the winter, but knew they had survived one Christmas without killing. By morning, it was over. The war continued. The lines held. The mist came back. New orders were issued. Guns were cleaned. No one ever mentioned it officially. It wasn't allowed. But it happened. And maybe that's enough. Because in the middle of a war built on ideology and invasion, there was a single night when men chose to share instead of shoot, when a song traveled farther than a bullet, when a bar of chocolate crossed a battlefield and was accepted like a gift from the sky. It wasn't peace, but it was something close. And it came quietly in the rain, wrapped in silence, lit by matchlight and gone by dawn. The man who hid in a suitcase. Some escapes are loud, explosive, covered in headlines and remembered through statues, but some are silent, invisible to almost everyone, hidden not in forests or under floorboards, but in something smaller, more ordinary, like a suitcase. This story takes place in Paris, under Nazi occupation. The year was 1943, and the city, once a place of lights, of music, of movement, had become quiet in a different way, controlled, patrolled, watched. For many, the streets were no longer safe, especially if your name, your accent, your ancestry, or your papers told the wrong story. For Jewish Parisians, for resistance members, and for anyone considered suspect, survival became a question of creativity. And for one man, a tailor, whose name has long been lost to time, it became a question of how to disappear completely. He had no path out of the city, no documents, no exit pass, no contact in the underground railway. But he had hands, and he had skill. He had sewn dresses, coats, and uniforms before the war. Now, he used that skill for something else. He acquired a large suitcase, the kind used for overseas travel, with a stiff frame and thick leather walls. He took it apart from the inside, removed its lining, and carefully reinforced its frame with narrow wooden beams. Then he padded the interior with cloth scraps, for silence, for stillness, for breath. His friend, a railway porter, had access to the platforms. A quiet man, a man who understood that resistance didn't always come with rifles. One night, while the city murmured under curfew, they moved together. The tailor folded himself into the suitcase, curled knees to chest, arms tucked in. He had trained for this, holding his breath, slowing his pulse. The lid was closed, buckled shut, locked. The porter lifted it onto a cart alongside other luggage and wheeled it past the checkpoint. No questions, just another bag among dozens. The suitcase was placed in the cargo hold of a train bound for the countryside. The journey would take 6 hours. There would be no stops, no air, no light. If he moved, he would be heard. If he panicked, it would all be over. Inside, it was quiet. More than quiet. It was total. He counted the seconds, then lost track. He felt the train rattle. He heard muffled footsteps above him. Once, he felt the case shift, slightly, as if something had been stacked on top. He didn't flinch, couldn't. Time disappeared. He imagined fabric, needles, coats he had sewn before the war. Anything to stay still, anything to stay alive. Finally, the train arrived. The case was unloaded by porters at a small rural station. The porter was there, waiting. He wheeled the case away, down a gravel road, out of sight. And only then, far from the tracks, behind a barn, did he open the lock. The tailor uncurled himself slowly, blinking into the light. He was pale, stiff, but alive. He had crossed a border without a passport, without a whisper, without even standing up. He would go on to survive the war. His name was never widely recorded. His story was passed on quietly, by those who knew him or knew of him. A story told not in books, but in murmurs, in disbelief, in admiration. And maybe that's how it should be. Not every escape needs a parade. Sometimes it only needs a suitcase, and a friend willing to carry it through the noise so someone else could breathe again in peace. The forest classroom. Sometimes survival doesn't look like hiding. It looks like learning. Even in a world unraveling, there are people who choose to teach. Not in buildings, not with blackboards, but in moments, in whispers, in places where children still exist, even when childhood has been taken. This story begins in a forest somewhere in eastern Poland, in the early 1940s. The exact location doesn't matter. What matters is the silence, the thick silence of trees that have seen too much. Beneath their branches, hidden from roads and patrols, a group of Jewish families had gone into hiding. They dug shelters into the forest floor, covered them with branches, insulated the walls with moss. There were no doors, only heavy cloth. No windows, only cracks in the wood that let in light like a secret. The children were not many, maybe 7 or 8 in total, ages ranging from 4 to 12. They were tired like their parents, pale, but still curious, still restless, still capable of wondering why the sky changed color at different hours, or how to spell their names. They had no paper, no pencils, nothing but what they carried with them. And one woman, named Rivka, who had once been a schoolteacher in a village that no longer existed. She did not stop teaching, not even here. Each morning, or what felt like morning, she would gather the children near the largest tree. They sat on logs or on the earth, bundled in coats that didn't fit. She spoke softly, not just to avoid detection, but because loudness no longer had a place in their world. She taught them the alphabet, tracing letters in the dirt with a stick. When it rained, she used her fingers to draw on the inside of the shelter's canvas roof. They repeated the letters back. One by one, slowly, she told them stories, old ones, full of stars and lions and brave children who crossed rivers. She asked questions, let them ask their own. Sometimes they spoke nonsense, just to speak. Sometimes they cried, but always they learned. She taught them math using acorns, division with stones, geography by memory, drawing the shape of Europe into the soil. They had no maps, so they imagined one together. Here is Poland, she would whisper, and here is where we are, beneath the trees, somewhere the maps don't show. When winter came, the lessons moved closer to the fire. They used the ashes as chalk on pieces of bark. Rivka made songs out of facts, days of the week, names of rivers, so the children could remember them even in the dark. And when a child had a nightmare, or missed a mother now gone, Rivka taught them how to write a feeling, even if it was just the word sad, scratched into a leaf with a twig. Each small act was a defiance, not of armies, but of forgetting. One day, the group had to move. A patrol had passed nearby. new sounds in the distance. They packed what little they had, buried the fire, covered the shelters. But before they left, Rivka paused. She gathered the children one more time, drew one last word in the dirt. Hope. They read it aloud, slowly. Then they erased it, as they always did, just in case. The forest closed behind them, but the lessons went with them. Most of those children survived. They scattered after the war, to cities and countries far from those woods. Some forgot the exact sound of her voice. Some didn't remember her name. But many, in interviews years later, mentioned a teacher. A woman who taught them under trees. A woman who never said, "We can't learn here," even when everything said otherwise. And it's possible that some of them became teachers too. Because education doesn't need walls. It only needs someone to say, "Let's begin," even in hiding, even in hunger. Even in a place where tomorrow is uncertain. A stick in the dirt can be a pen, a circle of children, a classroom, and the will to teach. That's a kind of light no forest can hide for long. The soup that saved a life. It's easy to think of survival as something dramatic, a last-second escape, a courageous leap, a defiant act that changes everything. But sometimes, survival is slow, quiet. Sometimes it comes not in the form of resistance or rescue, but in a bowl, or less than that. Just a sip of warmth when everything else is cold. In 1945, near the end of the war, a group of prisoners waited out the final days in a satellite camp near Bergen-Belsen. The name wouldn't mean much to those outside, just another place, another patch of land swallowed by suffering. But for the people inside, it was the end of a long, unraveling rope. There were no supplies, no medicine, no fuel, just people and time, and less of both each day. One prisoner, a man in his 30s, had collapsed. His body had stopped responding. He no longer spoke. He didn't open his eyes. He had sunk into that space many recognized, a space between life and something else. They had seen it before. Someone would fall silent. Their breathing would slow. And the others, who had watched too many times already, would look away. Not out of cruelty, out of preservation. They could not hold the weight of one more goodbye. But one man didn't look away. He had worked in a kitchen before the war. Nothing special, just a local cook in a quiet town. He had once believed food was about flavor, about timing, about celebration. But now, food was about survival. And in a place where there was barely enough for yourself, giving something away was a kind of sacred risk. Still, he noticed the man who had fallen. And instead of assuming he would not return, he made a choice. He saved a crust of bread for 2 days, traded it with another prisoner for a small bruised potato. Then, with a piece of tin pulled from a wrecked guard station, he made a crude bowl. He filled it with water, stolen from the cleaning bucket, added the potato, boiled it slowly over a smuggled candle flame. Then he tore up a few weeds that had grown along the fence, bitter herbs that wouldn't be noticed, but weren't poison. He stirred them in. It wasn't a meal. It wasn't even a full mouthful, but it was warm, and it was his. He knelt beside the man who had collapsed, tilted the bowl, waited. At first, nothing. Then the faintest flicker of motion. A swallow. Another. The man didn't speak, but the cook saw something in his face. Not awareness, not recognition, just breath. He fed him slowly, drop by drop, over an hour. Then again the next day, and again the day after that. He gave up half his rations for nearly a week. And finally, one morning, the man opened his eyes. He blinked. He tried to sit up, and he whispered a word that neither of them remembered later, but it was the first thing he had said in days. They survived, both of them. They didn't stay in touch after the war, not right away. Life scattered people quickly then. But decades later, at a reunion event hosted in Amsterdam, the man who had once been silent saw a familiar face. They stared at each other for a long time, and then, without speaking, they sat at the same table. The cook reached out, took a spoon from the setting, and laid it quietly between them. They both laughed. And then they cried. There were no photos of that soup, no witnesses, no recipe. But that moment, that offering, lasted longer than many battles. Because survival isn't always about running or fighting. Sometimes it's about holding on to enough warmth to pass it to someone else. Sometimes it's just soup, just one potato, just a drop of kindness served when everything else has gone cold. The photographer in the shadows. Some of the most powerful stories from World War II weren't written in words. They were captured in silence, framed through a lens, sealed inside a roll of film, and buried in the dirt, waiting for a future that might never come. This is the story of a man named Henrik Ross. Before the war, he was a sports photographer. Light, motion, smiling faces. He understood how to catch a moment before it slipped away. But when the Nazis sealed off the Jewish ghetto in Łódź, Poland, in 1940, his camera became something else. It became a witness. Henrik was assigned to take official photographs, images meant for German records, for propaganda, for identification. He was told what to shoot, who to photograph, which angles to capture. It was his job, his survival. But behind the lens, he saw more than orders. He saw humanity breaking and holding on. So he made a choice. A quiet one, a dangerous one. By day, he took what they told him to take. ID photos, labor documentation, scenes of productivity. But by night, he took others. He used the same camera, the same film, but turned it toward life as it truly was. He photographed children playing with sticks on broken sidewalks, a couple sharing a piece of bread on a windowsill, a boy holding his sister's hand as they waited in a soup line. Smiles, even laughter. Fear, of course, but also ordinary love. He hid the camera beneath his coat, waited for moments, trusted his instinct. Every click of the shutter was a risk, a defiance, a fragment of memory preserved. The Łódź ghetto was not like other places. It was isolated, controlled tightly. Almost nothing went in or out. Most of its inhabitants didn't survive the war, and as the liquidation began, as transports to death camps increased, as hunger deepened, as silence grew, Ross knew his time was running out. So one day, before he was taken, he dug a hole, a shallow pit in the corner of a yard behind a collapsed wall. He placed his negatives in sealed jars, wrapped them in fabric, covered them with dirt and stones. He said goodbye to them, not knowing if they would survive, not knowing if he would. But he did survive. And after the war, when he returned to that same spot, he began to dig. Some of the negatives were damaged by moisture, others destroyed by time. But hundreds remained. And when he held them up to the light, he saw what he had almost forgotten. Life. Not just the suffering, but the quiet insistence that people kept going, kept caring, kept being human when everything around them tried to strip that away. In the years that followed, those photographs became something rare. Not just historical documents, but emotional truths. They showed the war not from the outside, not from the view of soldiers or borders, but from within the walls of a place that had been cut off from the world. A place that was supposed to disappear without a trace. But because of Ross, it didn't. He didn't speak often about his work. When asked why he had taken the photos, he simply said, "I wanted to leave a record, not a message, not a judgment, just a record, a way of saying, we were here." And now, decades later, those images still whisper. In galleries, in books, on quiet screens. They whisper about bread passed hand to hand, about dignity worn in the face of hunger, about love, about loss, about resilience that refused to fade, not staged, not posed, just true. Because when the war ended, many voices were gone, but the photographs remained. And sometimes, That's how history remembers what courage never had the chance to say. The girl who wrote in feathers. In a time when entire cities were silenced, when names were erased, books were burned, and words were watched more closely than weapons, one young girl kept writing. Not because she was told to, not because anyone would ever read her words, but because writing made her feel like she still existed. Her name was Leah. She was 13, and she lived in a camp in Lithuania during the war, one of the many places where people were counted, separated, and told, in 100 quiet ways, that they no longer mattered. In that place, paper was forbidden. Pens were confiscated. Journals were dangerous. A sentence could be reported. A poem could mean punishment. But Leah needed to write. It was how she made sense of the world, even this one. So she looked for another way. She couldn't find a pencil. But one afternoon, while sweeping a yard near the kitchen waste, she found a feather, a bird feather, tangled in leaves and wire. And something about it felt like a key. She took it, hid it inside her shirt, and later, using soot mixed with water and the end of the feather sharpened against a stone, she began to write. Not on paper. There was none. She used fabric scraps, bits of sackcloth, even torn lining from her coat. Any surface that would hold ink, even for a moment. She didn't write stories, not at first. She wrote memories, short ones, just a line or two each night before sleep, while the others whispered or cried or stared at the ceiling. It snowed today. I miss my cat. My brother made a joke and I smiled. They called my name but let me go. Each sentence was an anchor, not to events but to herself. A way of saying, I am here. I am still thinking. I am still real. She stored the pieces in a crevice in the wall behind her bunk, layer by layer, rolled and pressed flat. When one was full, she started another. When she ran out of soot, she used crushed berries. Sometimes even her own blood. Just a drop. Anything that left a mark. Anything that proved she had something to say. The guards never noticed, or if they did, they never looked closely. She was just a child, after all, and children didn't matter in places like this. But her words did. To her, they mattered more than food, more than warmth. They were survival of a different kind, survival of the self. No one knew about her writings. Not then. Not until years later, when the camp was liberated. The buildings were torn down, the walls stripped bare, and in the crack behind one of the bunks, a small bundle of cloth pages was found, tied together with thread pulled from a lining seam. The ink had faded, the fabric was brittle, but the words were still there. Simple, human, whole. They weren't written for history. They weren't written to impress. They were just the truth of a girl who refused to let the world take her voice. A girl who wrote with feathers and soot and silence. A girl who used whatever she had to leave something behind. Today, those scraps are preserved in a museum, protected, translated, read aloud by school children who will never know what hunger feels like in that way. And when they read them, they understand something unspoken. That even in a place designed to erase you, a sentence can keep you whole. Because Leah did not shout, she did not fight, she just wrote. And in doing so, she was never truly lost. The librarian of the rubble. It was 1942, and the city of Hamburg was no longer a city the way people remembered it. The streets had been leveled, the houses cracked and open like broken teeth. The air still smelled faintly of smoke, days after the bombs had fallen. The British raids had left behind something not quite silence, but something quieter than sound. It was the silence of things missing, doors that no longer closed, families who no longer returned, buildings reduced to bricks, and bricks reduced to dust. And yet, in the middle of all this, in the middle of what most people would call nothing, a young boy named Emil wandered through what was left of his school. He wasn't looking for anything, just walking. Sometimes people did that after the bombings, not because they expected to find something, but because movement felt better than stillness. He climbed over what had once been a hallway, now a slope of scattered wood and broken glass. His shoes were worn, his coat too thin, but he kept walking until he reached a room that had somehow kept its shape, just barely. It was the old library. The windows were gone, the roof had peeled back like a torn envelope. The floor was warped and wet in places, but in one corner there stood a tall wooden cabinet, blackened but upright. Inside, books. Not many. Most had been destroyed, but a few remained, tilted at odd angles, their covers curled from heat, their pages tinged with soot. Emile reached in and pulled one free. The spine cracked. The title was half burned away, but the words inside, faded though they were, could still be read. So he sat down in the corner, in a patch of sunlight, and began to read. Not for long. Maybe 10 minutes. But it was enough. It reminded him that not everything had vanished, that something had survived, and that it could be held, that it could still speak. He returned the next day, and the day after that, and eventually he brought another child with him, then 2 more. By the end of the week, there were 6 of them, all sitting quietly on upturned crates, passing the same 5 books back and forth, careful not to tear them further. There was no teacher, no roll call, no rules, just a shared understanding that something sacred was happening in that broken room. Emile started to bring thread and tape. He mended the books as best he could, patching corners, tightening spines. He borrowed chalk from a neighbour and wrote their names on the inside covers. Property of the Rubble Library. He didn't call himself a librarian. He didn't need to. The others began to call him that, not as a title, but as a thank you. Soon, they had a lending system. 1 child could borrow a book for a night, 2 if they promised to return it clean. Emile kept a list on a scrap of cloth nailed to the wall, and somehow, in a city with no working clocks, with no working schools, with so much loss it felt like language itself had been buried, there was a library again. It didn't last forever. One day, a heavy storm came, and the half roof gave way. Rain soaked the room. 2 of the books were ruined. Another was taken by an older boy who never brought it back. But by then, the library had already done its work. It had reminded 6 children that there were still stories, that there were still things worth reading, worth protecting, that even when buildings fall, words don't always fall with them. Emile survived the war. He became a teacher, quietly, in a school that had windows again. Years later, in an interview, someone asked him when he knew he wanted to teach. He paused, smiled, and said, "There was this one library. It had no shelves, no rules, no roof, but it had readers, and that was enough. Because even in war, even among ashes, if someone is reading, then something human is still standing. The dressmaker's code. Not all codes are typed. Not all secrets are whispered. Sometimes they are sewn, slowly, stitch by stitch, into places no one thinks to check." This story takes place in a small Belgian town during the early years of the German occupation. A town where people walked quietly, looked down when passing soldiers, and learned how to blend silence into everyday life. And on one narrow street, nestled between a bakery and a butcher, there was a small tailor's shop. Nothing flashy, just a narrow doorway with a faded sign, a single mannequin in the window, and a seamstress who rarely spoke unless asked to. Her name was Lotte. She was in her 40s, unmarried, polite, but distant. To most, she was simply practical. The kind of woman who measured without asking twice, who finished her work on time, who didn't smile easily, but never gave reason for suspicion, which made her the perfect person to hide something. As the war spread and resistance networks began to grow in secret, Lotte became a messenger, not with words, not with radios or typewriters, but with thread and fabric. She had always been good with patterns. Now she created a new one made of codes. She would take the jacket of a German officer and hem it perfectly. But inside the lining, hidden beneath layers of interfacing, she'd slip a piece of thread in a specific color: red for danger, blue for safe passage. Sometimes a buttonhole would be just slightly too wide, signaling a message was ready for pickup. Other times, she stitched actual notes, tiny bits of rice paper, into cuffs, collars, or the seams of trousers. Coordinates, names, times to move, instructions for couriers who didn't even know what they were carrying. Lotta never rushed. That was part of it. Each stitch was deliberate. She would hum softly to herself as she worked, not because she was happy, but because rhythm helped her focus. She had a needle she trusted, a thimble from her grandmother, and an old Singer machine that purred like a cat when she kept the belt oiled. Her shop became a quiet crossing point, a thread in the larger fabric of resistance, and almost no one noticed. One day, a German officer returned unexpectedly. He had torn his coat on patrol and wanted it mended fast. She nodded, took the coat, offered him tea while he waited. Her hands trembled just once, briefly, as she unpicked the thread. Not because she feared being caught, but because the message inside the seam hadn't been collected yet. She slid it out quickly when he wasn't looking, hid it beneath her foot. Later, she burned it. Nothing left behind, no record, no trail. She never spoke about what she did, not during the war, not even after. When Belgium was liberated, she simply closed her shop for one day, swept the floors, and opened again the next morning like nothing had happened. The same sign in the window, the same mannequin, just fewer soldiers, and slowly, a different kind of silence settled over the town, one made not of fear, but of memory. Years later, a historian tracing resistance activity found a record of intercepted messages. One had been sewn into a uniform, carried across the border, and helped prevent an ambush. When asked who had made the uniform, a former courier remembered only one thing: she had a sharp needle and sharper eyes. No statues were built, no medals handed out. Lotta passed away in the 1970s, but her sewing machine still sits in a museum now, not because it made clothes, but because it stitched together pieces of freedom in the most ordinary way imaginable. Because resistance doesn't always roar. Sometimes it hums. And sometimes it's folded neatly in a hem. The night owl radio. In the middle of a war that tried to control every voice, some voices still found their way through. Not with volume, not with fire, but with static and wires and soft clicks in the dark. This story takes place in the Netherlands, in a university town where the buildings had gone quiet, but the ideas had not. By 1943, the German occupation had tightened. Students were drafted. Professors were watched. Books vanished from shelves. Radios were banned, or worse, repurposed to play only what was allowed. The air itself, it seemed, had been captured. But deep beneath the old university library, behind a panel of bricks that no one ever touched, something different was happening. They called it the Owl. Not officially, not even aloud. It was just a nickname that grew in whispers. A secret radio, built by 3 students using what they had left. An old phonograph needle, parts from a broken bicycle lamp, copper stripped from discarded telephone lines. The first time it turned on, it buzzed too loudly. The second time, it crackled. But the third time, it caught a signal, a BB broadcast, in Dutch. They listened in silence, crowded in a damp space the size of a closet. Words floated across the air, news from London, updates on the war, stories that didn't match the leaflets scattered by soldiers in the streets. They listened again the next night, and the next. Then they started to write it down. Not everything, just the parts that mattered, the parts that felt true. They copied the news onto scraps of paper. Lists of names, warnings about planned arrests, descriptions of sabotage successes, in places they hadn't known were still fighting back. Then, late at night, they delivered those pages, slid beneath doorsteps, hidden inside loaves of bread, tucked into library books that no one ever checked out anymore. They didn't sign them. They didn't take credit. The owl never spoke for itself. It just spoke. Once, a message was hidden inside the lining of a violin case. Another was folded into a cigarette packet and handed off with a nod outside the market. The messages were passed from person to person, no one holding them too long, no one knowing where they began. But people read them. They shared them. And for many, it was the only way to know that the world was still moving, that somewhere beyond the silence, someone was still speaking their language. It lasted 2 years, 2 years of static and ink, 2 years of late nights spent waiting for the right frequency, copying by candlelight, holding breath when footsteps echoed on the stairs. They changed locations 3 times. Once, they buried the transmitter in a box filled with flour to muffle its sound. Another time, they wired it through a piano, so if the room was searched, it would appear they were tuning an instrument. No one was caught, not officially. After the war, only one photograph of the group was found. Blurred, taken from a distance, all faces turned slightly away. They didn't want recognition. They wanted reach. The owl was never about fame. It was about staying awake when the world tried to sleep through its own conscience. The old brick wall was repaired after the war. The library was rebuilt. The transmitter is long gone. But sometimes, when visitors walk through the basement, there's a plaque, small and unassuming, that reads, "Here the night spoke." And that's the truth of it. The owl didn't hoot. It didn't scream. It whispered, and even whispers can fly far when the world leans in to listen. A violin at the edge of the world. In the far reaches of Siberia, where winter doesn't arrive, it simply never leaves, there was a camp. It wasn't on a map. At least, not one you could find in a bookstore or classroom. But it was real. A Soviet prisoner of war camp, buried under snow, days away from the nearest village. It was surrounded not by fences, but by cold. A kind of cold that made silence feel heavy. And in that place, there was a man named Franz. Franz had once been a factory worker, a German soldier, drafted, captured, shipped east across endless rail lines until the trees thinned and the sky stayed grey for months at a time. He didn't speak Russian. He didn't cause trouble. He did what was asked, kept his eyes down, and tried to stay warm. That was the routine. Wake, work, eat, sleep, repeat. But one morning, just before the light shifted from night to another kind of night, a guard approached him holding something. A long, thin case made of wood, the edges worn and splintered. It was tied shut with old rope. The guard didn't speak. He simply held it out, then walked away. Franz stood there confused, then opened it. Inside was a violin. Not new, not polished. The strings were snapped, the bridge was missing. The body had a crack that ran along its side like a scar, but it was unmistakable. A violin here, of all places. Franz hadn't played in years, not since before the war, and even then, only for family. He was never trained, just taught himself slowly, late at night in his parents' kitchen with sheet music borrowed from a neighbour. But the moment he touched the wood, something returned. Not skill, not confidence, but memory. He spent the next 2 weeks fixing it, quietly, secretly. He used melted boot glue to reseal the crack, carved a new bridge from a piece of firewood, replaced the strings with thin wire pulled from the inside of a broken lamp. He tuned it by ear, his hands clumsy from cold. But finally, one evening, he drew the bow across the strings. The sound wasn't perfect. It wavered, it whispered, but it was music, and in a place where everything echoed, where footsteps cracked like thunder and voices echoed off frozen walls, it felt like light had entered the room. He played for himself at first, always late, always softly. Then a bunkmate asked to listen. then 2, then 10. One night, even the guards stood outside the barracks. They didn't say a word, just listened. Franz played waltzes, lullabies, old German folk songs. Once, he tried a bit of Tchaikovsky, and someone cried. He never played for applause. There was no stage, just a plank of wood beside a stove, but what he gave in that place, in that far edge of the world, was something no one else could. A pause, a breath, a reminder of something better. When the war ended and prisoners were released, Franz left the violin behind. Not because he wanted to forget it, but because he knew someone else might need it. Years later, when asked about it, he said, "I never played well, but I played true, and sometimes that's all a person needs to hear." Maybe that's why the story remained. Passed along by men who had no photographs, no records, just the memory of music where no music should have been. A melody drifting through frost, carving its way through sorrow, like the warmest sound in the coldest place. Because even at the edge of the world, a single note can find its way home. The hidden names. In a quiet corner of southern France, tucked behind hills and winding roads, there stood a convent, tall stone walls, ivy-covered arches, and silence so soft you could hear the echo of your own footsteps. During the war, it was known only to a few, not because it hid weapons or passed messages, but because it hid something else, something more fragile, something far more dangerous. Children. They arrived in the middle of the night, always quietly, sometimes with mothers, sometimes alone. Jewish children, too young to understand what was happening. Their names had been shouted before, on lists, on corners, in train stations. Now, those names had to vanish, quickly, quietly, for their own protection. The nuns took them in. They were women who had taken vows of silence, of simplicity, of service. But now, they became something else too. Guardians of names. They assigned new identities, gave the children new baptismal certificates, new surnames, new stories to memorize. "Your name is Marie now," they would whisper. "You have always been Marie." And the child, confused, afraid, would nod. But the nuns did not forget the real names. They wrote them down, everyone, each original name carefully recorded, along with the child's real birthday, hometown, parents. They kept those names in a second ledger, separate from the official convent records. That book did not sit on a shelf. It was placed in a wooden box wrapped in cloth and hidden beneath a loose floorboard beneath the chapel stairs. Only 3 women knew where it was. And every Sunday night, after prayers, Sister Catherine would open the box, light a single candle, and whisper every name aloud. Slowly, as if the sound of those names would hold the children's truth in place until the world was safe again. The children never knew. They were too young. They were taught catechism, made to dress like the others, blend in, kneel when told. But at night, some of them still whispered the names they remembered. The ones they weren't supposed to say anymore. The names of mothers, of fathers, of homes that might no longer exist. The nuns would hear them sometimes through the stone walls and say nothing. The convent was never raided. Whether by luck or by divine protection, no soldier ever asked to see the second ledger. But if they had, the penalty would have been death, not just for the sisters, but for the children too. And yet, the book remained, safe, whole. When the war ended, families came looking. Some found what they had lost. Most didn't. But those who came to that convent were given something. A record, a name spoken back to them, a real birthday, a real place of origin, proof that someone had remembered when it was most dangerous to remember. Sister Catherine lived into old age. She never left the convent, never wrote a memoir. But she told one visitor, shortly before her death, that she had never broken a vow. "I only spoke the names," she said. "I didn't speak of them." And now, that second ledger is preserved in a small archive in Lyon. It sits behind glass, not grand, just a simple book. But inside it, hundreds of names that were never meant to survive. Survived. Because remembering is a kind of resistance. And sometimes saying a name, even in a whisper, is enough to keep a life from disappearing. The painter who used ashes. Sometimes creation is an act of survival, not loud, not celebrated, just quiet work done in forgotten corners. And sometimes it isn't about beauty at all. It's about memory, about marking time in places where time is meant to stand still. In a prison camp on the edge of Thessaloniki, Greece, a hot, dusty place surrounded by barbed wire and quiet cruelty, there was a man named Nikolaos. He had been a painter before the war, not famous, just known well enough to have painted signs for restaurants, icons for churches, and soft landscapes of olive trees in springtime. He used colour back then, blues, ochres, the gold used in halos. But the war had taken his brushes, his studio, his oils. What it hadn't taken was his eye. He was assigned to labour duty, like everyone else, hauling crates, clearing rubble, stacking supplies under the eyes of guards who didn't speak much but watched everything. The prisoners worked in silence, heads down, hands blistered. There was no future, no plan, just the day, and the next, and the one after. But one evening, while sweeping the inside of a supply shed, Nikolaos noticed the wall, bare concrete, stained with soot, old paint, and handprints from the ones who'd passed before him. He found a piece of burnt wood in the corner, maybe from a broken cart or a campfire no one had cleaned up. He picked it up and rubbed it gently on the wall. Just a line at first, then a curve, then another, a wave, a tree, a sun. It was barely visible, just a whisper of black against grey, but it was enough. He came back the next night, then the next. Always alone, always quick, always quiet. He used ash, dirt, even crushed leaves to make texture. He broke a spoon and sharpened the handle into a point. He used his fingers when nothing else worked. And slowly, the wall began to change. Not into a mural, not something polished, but into something that breathed. A woman dancing beneath fig trees, a man standing beside a boat, a donkey under an open sky. Memory in fragments. Other prisoners noticed. They said nothing. But when they passed through the shed, they paused. Some smiled. Some wept. Some placed their hands lightly on the wall, as if to steady themselves. It didn't feel like escape. It felt like remembering what it was to feel whole. The guards noticed too. One day the wall was scrubbed clean, harsh brushes, buckets of water. A warning shouted. Nikolaos stood by and said nothing. That night, he painted it again. This happened more than once. The wall would live, then vanish, then come back. He never stopped. Even when his hands ached from labour, even when his knees shook from hunger, he never asked for help. But once, a fellow prisoner handed him a handful of charcoal stolen from the kitchen stove. Another time, someone gave him a piece of cloth to wrap his wrist. The war ended. The camp was abandoned. Time moved on. Years later, that building was partially restored as a memorial site. The original wall, or what was left of it, still bore faint outlines beneath layers of concrete. Conservators noticed it, carefully removed the modern plaster, and beneath, in soft surviving lines, was the ghost of a dance, a figure mid-motion, drawn in ashes that had refused to fully fade. They traced it back to Nikolaos. He had returned to painting, quietly, in a village near the sea. When asked about the camp, he said very little. Just that he tried to keep his hands moving. That when the world goes dark, you don't always need light. Sometimes, just a shadow will do. And so his wall remains, in part, in echo, not as decoration, but as defiance. Because even when colour is gone and canvas is denied, the soul will still find something to hold on to, even if it's only a bit of ash, and the will to remember. Puzzle pieces. Sometimes, a story doesn't shout its meaning. It doesn't announce itself as history, or make a noise that leaves a mark. Sometimes, it unfolds in silence, piece by piece, until you understand what it was trying to say all along. In a city called Prague, during a winter of occupation and curfews, a little girl sat by a window and played with a puzzle. That's how this story begins. She was maybe 7, maybe 8. Her family had once lived in a brighter apartment, with books on the shelves and music in the kitchen. But the war had taken much of that away. They lived now in a smaller place, quieter, with curtains always drawn and footsteps kept soft. Her father had been taken. Her mother rarely spoke. But the puzzle remained. It was old, worn at the edges. Half the pieces were missing. Some had been lost under furniture they no longer owned. Some had never been there at all, but the girl played with it every morning anyway, sorting, trying to fit the same corners together, imagining what the picture might have once been. It wasn't about finishing it. It was about the movement, the pieces, the feeling of making something fit when everything else felt broken. Their apartment faced the street, not a busy one, just a narrow lane that sometimes saw soldiers pass through, German uniforms, boots that echoed, faces that didn't turn. The girl was told never to stand too close to the window, but she did anyway, only when the puzzle sat in her lap, only when the sky was grey and quiet. And then one morning, something changed. A soldier passed beneath the window. She didn't look at him, not directly, but he paused, just for a second. Then he continued walking. The next day, he passed again, and again he paused. A little longer this time. She didn't smile, she didn't wave, but she didn't move either. The puzzle was in her lap, her hands still. On the third day, something small landed on the windowsill. A piece of wood, carved, roughly sanded. A puzzle piece, hand-carved to fit. She looked up, but the soldier was already gone. She showed it to her mother, who said nothing, just stared at it, then closed the curtain. But the girl placed it in the puzzle. It didn't match the shape, not quite, but it fit. And somehow, that was enough. A week passed. Then another piece came. Then another. Always at dawn. Always alone. They were never left in plain sight, just tucked against the wall or under the lip of the windowsill. Her mother began to leave the window open just slightly, no longer protesting. And the girl kept building. By spring, the puzzle was full. Not perfect, but whole. Wooden pieces mixed with the original cardboard ones. Soft colours blending with carved grain. It didn't matter what the image had once been. It had become something new. When the war ended, they never saw the soldier again. His name was never known. His uniform had said one thing, but his eyes, just briefly through the glass, had said something else. That he saw her, that he noticed the girl and her puzzle, and decided, in whatever quiet way he could, to give something back. Years later, the woman, now grown, still had the puzzle, framed in a wooden box, hung not in the living room, but beside her writing desk, where she could see it each morning. She never told many people, but when she did, she always ended the story the same way. He didn't leave a message, just the pieces. But I understood. Because sometimes kindness doesn't speak. It doesn't ask for thanks. It just finds its place and settles quietly, where it was needed most. The clock that kept time in secret. In a factory on the outskirts of a nameless town, somewhere under occupation, somewhere behind gates, there was a room full of machines, the kind that never stopped. The workers inside were tired, not just physically, but inwardly. Their backs hurt, their hands cracked, their eyes learned to move without drawing attention. Every sound meant something. Every silence meant more. This was a place where time was not yours. It belonged to the guards, to the shift bell, to the routine that stretched endlessly from morning into night. But there was a clock on the wall above Station 5. Not a fancy clock. Just a square face with numbers that had faded over years of steam and dust. The glass was cracked. The hands stuck sometimes. Most people ignored it. But not the man who worked beneath it. His name was Eli. Quiet, careful, maybe 50. No one knew exactly where he came from or what he did before. He didn't speak much, and when he did, it was mostly to ask for tools. But every day, without fail, at exactly 2:17 in the afternoon, he reached behind the clock and tapped twice. Just 2 soft taps, a sound that disappeared into the hum of the machines. At first, no one noticed. Then a woman at Station 6 did. She'd been hiding a torn scrap of bread under her apron for someone too weak to work. But the timing mattered. If she passed it too early, the guards might notice. If too late, it would be missed. When she heard the taps, she moved. No one stopped her. After that, it became known. The clock, broken though it was, now marked a moment to pass things. Information, food, a whispered warning. A folded message slipped under a hand. The clock became more than a decoration. It became a kind of heartbeat. And Eli, the keeper of time no one else could see, the guards never caught on. The clock didn't move after all. It didn't signal anything. Just hung there, frozen in place. A trick of familiarity, something too ordinary to question. But for those who listened, who counted the seconds and learned the rhythm, it was everything. Some say Eli had rewired it somehow, not to work, but to hum faintly when danger was near. Others say it was luck, but those who knew him knew the truth. He was watching, always watching. He could see when a guard's eyes wandered, when a routine changed, and when he tapped the clock, it meant now, move now, say it now, help someone now. After the war, the factory was shut down, the machines were scrapped, the building sold. But the clock was removed with care, preserved. It still doesn't work. Its hands are still stuck at 2:17, but it sits now in a small museum, not far from that nameless town, with a plaque that reads, "Time stood still, but kindness moved." No recordings, no photographs, just memory, carried by those who lived because someone gave them 1 second, at the right time. Because time isn't always measured in hours. Sometimes it's 2 soft taps on a wall, a pause, a breath, and a decision to make that one moment count. Letters that never arrived. In the corner of an old farmhouse near Krakow, tucked inside a drawer lined with faded cloth, there sat a bundle of letters. Over 300 of them, each carefully folded, dated, and addressed in the same soft handwriting. They were written in Polish, in pen that had grown faint with time, and they all began the same way. My beloved. None of the letters had stamps. None had been mailed. There were no return addresses, no envelopes torn open with shaking hands, no reply. Because the woman who wrote them, her name was Zofia, knew from the beginning that no one would write back. Her husband had been taken in 1941, one of the many pulled from his home by soldiers with hard eyes and tighter orders. There was no warning, no explanation, just the sound of boots and the slam of a truck door. She never learned where they sent him. Not exactly. Maybe a camp, maybe a prison, maybe worse. But she chose to believe, in the smallest corner of her heart, that he was still alive. Somewhere. Waiting. So she began to write. At first she wrote every day, then every other, then once a week. But she never stopped. In the letters, she didn't talk about the war. Not really. She talked about the chickens, the way the roof creaked when the wind turned from the north, the apricot tree that had bloomed too early. She told him about neighbours who had returned, who had vanished. She told him about her hands, how they ached now when she held the milk pail too long. She wrote about the sound the fireplace made late at night, how sometimes it reminded her of his voice. She never asked him where he was, never demanded he come back. She simply wrote as if he might still read them, as if his absence was just distance, not disappearance. Each letter ended the same way. "I'm still here, I'll be waiting." She stored them all in the same drawer, tied in bundles of twine, kept dry under the lining she had sewn into the bottom during better years. No one else knew about them. They were hers alone. Her private conversation with silence. When the war ended, she searched for his name, checked lists, asked questions, but it never appeared. No confirmation, no grave, just the grey space between knowing and not knowing. The cruel place where hope is both a gift and a weight. She never remarried. She never moved. She kept the farm running, quiet as always. And once a year, on the anniversary of the day he was taken, she opened the drawer, untied the ribbons, and read one letter aloud by candlelight. Just one. Then she folded it again, placed it back, and said good night. After she passed, the letters were discovered by a relative clearing the house. At first, they didn't understand. They thought they were unsent love notes. But then they read them. Not all, just a few. And what they found was not grief exactly, not longing either, but presence, devotion, proof that love, when held quietly enough, could stretch across time without tearing. The letters now rest in an archive, not for display, not for translation, just preserved, protected, kept together. Because not every story is about arrival. Some are about the act of writing, the act of remembering, even when no one answers. Especially then, the bear that marched to Berlin. War is a story told with uniforms, with commands, with fear. But sometimes, it's also told with a bear, not as a symbol, not as a metaphor, but a real bear, one with fur and paws, and a habit of stealing apples when no one was looking. His name was Wojtek, and yes, he marched with soldiers, real soldiers, into real battle. The story begins in 1942. A group of Polish soldiers had just made their way through Iran, part of the long, winding journey that took exiled Polish troops from Siberia all the way to the Middle East, and eventually to the front lines in Europe. They had seen too much already, lost too many friends. And in the middle of a supply station near Hamadan, they found something unexpected. A small bear cub, alone, whimpering, no mother nearby, just fur and fear and enormous eyes. One of the soldiers offered it a can of condensed milk. Another wrapped it in a blanket. The bear, too young to even stand properly, nestled into the soldier's lap, and from that moment on, he was part of the unit. They named him Wojtek. It means little warrior, and he grew quickly. The soldiers fed him fruit, honey, even beer. Not often, just enough to make him feel included. He would sit beside them during meals, pouring at tin cups, mimicking their movements. He learned to salute. He learned to carry heavy sacks on his shoulders. And, over time, the men stopped thinking of him as a mascot. He was a comrade. When the unit was transferred to Italy to fight in the Battle of Monte Cassino, a problem arose. Animals weren't allowed to be transported officially with troops, so the soldiers did what any good brothers in arms would do. They enlisted him, gave him a rank, a number. He became Private Wojtek of the 22nd Artillery Supply Company. During the battle, Wojtek didn't just march. He carried ammunition, crates of it, one by one. He walked upright like a man, loaded with mortar shells, placing them near the guns. He never dropped a crate, never panicked. The sound of fire didn't frighten him. He trusted the men beside him, and they trusted him right back. The image of a bear carrying ammunition through smoke and ruin became legend. After the war, it was drawn as the company's official emblem, a bear holding a shell. A symbol not of power, but of loyalty. of something impossibly gentle, refusing to be left behind. When the war ended, Wojtek couldn't return to Poland. It was no longer the Poland they remembered. The unit was relocated to Scotland, and Wojtek went with them. He lived at the Edinburgh Zoo, but he was never just another animal behind glass. Veterans would visit him regularly. They would stand at the edge of his enclosure and call out to him in Polish. Sometimes he would rise on 2 legs and raise a paw in salute. He never forgot them, and they never forgot him. He died in 1963, old and heavy, but remembered. There are statues of him now, in Edinburgh, in London, in Krakow. But none of those statues can explain the full story. None can show you the way a group of tired, displaced men found comfort in something wild, and how that wild thing gave them something to protect again, something to laugh with, something to march beside. Because sometimes in war, what keeps you human isn't strategy or victory. Sometimes it's a bear named Wojtek, walking quietly beside you, reminding you that even in fire, there is still something worth holding close. The house with the painted windows. In a small Polish village just outside Lublin, there stood a house that seemed to glow, not from electricity, not from any light you could see during the day, but from something softer, something quieter. It was blue, not a bright blue, not a clean one, faded in places, scuffed by wind, dust and time, but unmistakably blue. The shutters were white, peeling slightly, with tiny painted flowers in the corners that someone had once taken the time to add, brush by brush. It was the kind of house that looked like it remembered something, even if it no longer had the words. The woman who lived there was called Irina. She was in her 60s when the war began, already widowed once, quiet, kind. Her neighbours had left when the fighting came closer. Some gone east, others hiding with family, a few simply disappearing in the night. But Irina stayed. Not because she was brave, at least she wouldn't have called herself that. She stayed because her husband, long before the war, had once said, "If I'm ever lost, I'll find my way home by the light in our window." It was a joke then, a sweet thing he said after a late walk in the snow. But now, it was something else, a thread she couldn't cut. So every night, Irina lit a candle. Just one, always in the same window, the front one, the one that faced the main road. She placed it in a glass jar to keep it steady, watched it flicker against the pane. Then she would sit in her chair, not directly beside it, but close enough to watch the flame move ever so slightly with the night breeze. That was her ritual. That, and the blue paint she touched up herself, whenever the weather allowed. "If the world is falling apart," she said once to a passing soldier, "then I will keep one corner of it looking the way it's supposed to." The soldiers noticed the house, first the Germans, then others. They never stopped, never searched it. Maybe because it seemed too small, too quiet, too fragile. Maybe because of the flowers on the shutters. But they noticed the light. So did others. One evening, a young girl, maybe 12, appeared at the gate, thin, mud on her shoes, holding a bag too large for her arms. She said nothing, just pointed at the window. Irina opened the door and let her in. She didn't ask where the girl came from. She didn't ask how she knew. But that night, there were 2 chairs by the window. Word spread, slowly, quietly, like all the best things do in a world that doesn't want them to. Refugees, lost children, a man limping from the woods, a mother carrying her son. They didn't come in crowds, just one by one, sometimes weeks apart. And Irina never asked how they found her. She only asked if they wanted tea. The candle burned for 462 nights. She counted, not out loud, not on paper, but by memory. The wax melted differently in winter. In spring, the glass would fog. She knew each variation like a musician knows a song by heart. Sometimes, when no one came, she would still leave the door unlocked, just in case. And sometimes people passed by and didn't knock, but they saw the light, and something in them felt warmer, even if only for a moment. Her husband never returned. She knew, somewhere deep down, that he wouldn't. But that wasn't why she kept the candle lit. Not after the first year. She kept it burning because someone always needed to know that not everything had gone dark. After the war, the house remained. The candle was no longer needed, but the window stayed blue. The paint faded more slowly now, touched only by memory and sun. People still walked by it. Some paused. A few left flowers by the fence. There is a plaque on the gate now. It doesn't say much, just one line. Here, the light was never lost. Because in a time when the world seemed to forget itself, one woman remembered. And her window, small and flickering, was enough to help others find their way home. The school beneath the bakery. In wartime, Budapest, the scent of bread still drifted through the streets. Not every day, not like before, but sometimes, early in the morning when the wind shifted just right, it would wrap itself around corners and doorways and broken windows like a memory. And when people smelled it, even through the hunger, even through the fear, they'd pause. Because it meant that one place, at least, was still trying to feel like home. The bakery sat on a quiet street not far from the river. Its windows were dust-smudged, its awning faded, but the ovens still worked, and inside them, a man named Istvan baked whatever he could. Thin loaves, rye biscuits, small rolls when flour was scarce. He didn't smile often, but he nodded when greeted, and he always kept one side door unlocked. What most people didn't know, not at first, was what lay beneath the bakery. Down a narrow stair, past crates of flour and bins of ash, there was a basement. Just one room, low ceiling, stone walls, a small lamp hanging from a wire. That was the classroom. The students arrived one by one, always in pairs, always through the back alley. They were children, Jewish children, hidden in attics, boarded apartments, or passed between neighbours under new names and whispered promises. Some hadn't spoken in days. Others had forgotten how to sit still. But they came. The teacher was a woman named Edith. She had taught at a proper school once with rows of desks and bells that signalled the start and end of lessons. Now she taught under a bakery. No chalkboard, no books, just her voice, and paper scraps pulled from old ledgers. She wrote letters in the air with her finger. She used coins to teach arithmetic. For reading, she told stories from memory. Fables, folk tales. The history of Hungary retold in quiet rhyme so the youngest could follow along. The children sat on sacks of grain. Their pencils were stubs shared between them. But they learned. Some days, they read in whispers so soft you could barely hear the vowels. Other days, they only listened, tired, cold, but there. The basement was warm, always warm, from the ovens above. And when the bread was ready, Istvan would send down a piece. Just one. Cut into thin slices, shared carefully. The children never complained. They were just glad to taste something real. There were rules. If there was bombing, the lamp was turned off and the lesson paused. If soldiers came to the street, the children lay flat and held their breath. If someone cried, Edith took their hand, pressed it gently, and kept teaching. Her voice never shook, even when her own hands did. She never spoke of what she had lost. The other teachers, her classroom, her sister. She only spoke of what still mattered. The alphabet, multiplication, stories, hope. One child later remembered, "We read in whispers, but we felt loud inside." The school lasted through 2 winters. Some students moved on, to safer places, or not so safe ones. Others came to take their spot. No roll was ever called, no certificates given. But every lesson mattered. After the war, the bakery reopened like nothing had happened. The bread still smelled the same. Istvan never mentioned the children. Neither did Edith. But if you asked her why she stayed, she would simply say, "If they're still growing, then we still teach." Today, there is no plaque, no museum, no marker on that basement door, just the soft scent of bread that still floats down that street, and the memory of a classroom that refused to stay silent, even underground. Because war can take buildings. It can take bells and desks and chalk. But it cannot unteach what was once learned in warmth, by light, and by heart. The mechanic who made wings. In a dusty camp somewhere in northern Italy, far from home and even farther from hope, a man named Luca kept his hands busy. He was a mechanic, had been before the war and still was, though now his tools were borrowed, and the machines he fixed didn't belong to him. They were carts mostly, and bicycles used by German officers, sometimes a broken-down truck. Nothing glamorous, nothing with wings. But Luca had always loved wings. He had been fascinated by flight since he was a boy. When the war came, he didn't get to fly. He repaired. He mended what others broke. And now, in this labor camp tucked into the edge of a crumbling village, surrounded by barbed wire and guarded eyes, he still repaired, quietly, methodically, and in silence. But at night, when the sky turned dark and the camp went still, he built something else. It started with scraps, wooden planks pulled from crates, curved spokes from broken wheels, cloth patches taken from discarded uniforms. He hoarded nails, straightened bent wire. He worked with no plan, no sketches, just memory and instinct. He carved frames, delicate and light, shaped like wings. Not the heavy wings of airplanes, but the light ones, of birds, curved, fragile-looking, human-sized, almost theatrical. He stretched cloth across them, glued the seams with paste made from flour and water. His hands, calloused and tired from the day's repairs, softened when they held these things. He didn't tell anyone why, not even his bunkmates. Maybe they assumed it was art, or madness, or simply a way to pass time when time no longer moved. But Luca had a reason. He wanted someone, anyone, to look up and remember what rising looked like, even if it only lasted a moment. There were 6 wings in total, some larger than others. He hung them from the rafters of the old maintenance shed where he slept, just beneath the roof, where the moonlight sometimes fell through the cracks and turned the cloth silver. The guards never noticed, or if they did, they said nothing. They probably thought it was harmless, just another prisoner playing with scraps. Then, one night, everything changed. An Allied bombing raid had begun. It was far off at first, the low drone of planes, the tremble in the ground like distant thunder. Then closer, too close. A fire broke out in one of the outer buildings, flames rising fast as the dry air fed them. Shouts echoed, chaos followed, and as the roof of the maintenance shed cracked from the heat, a gust of wind rushed upward, and the wings caught it. One by one, the wings Luca had built were lifted into the night, not with grace, not smoothly, but they floated, like strange paper birds lit by firelight. The prisoners saw them first, then the guards. Then, for a breathless moment, everyone stopped. Even the war seemed to pause. The wings drifted high over the fences, carried not far, not fast, but far enough to be seen. Some crashed, some curled into the dark. One vanished over a ridge and was never found again. But all of them left the ground. Luca watched in silence, standing near the shed, his eyes reflecting flame and flight. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. He just watched. After the fire, the shed was gone. The camp changed. But people remembered the wings. They whispered about them at night. Did you see them? Were they real? Did they mean something? Luca survived. After the war, he went back to fixing things. Bicycles again. Later, a small garage. He never spoke of the wings, but a visitor to his shop once noticed something. Hanging above the workbench, almost out of sight, was a small wooden frame, delicate, curved, stretched with fabric the color of ash. He said it was nothing, just something old. But maybe it was more. Maybe it was proof that even when your feet are chained to the ground, your hands can still build something that knows how to rise. The chair in the field. In southern France, where the hills roll low and the wind travels slowly through the grass, there is a field. Not a famous one, not marked on any map, just a stretch of green and gold that dips gently before climbing into olive groves and stone fences. During the war, soldiers passed through this place often. Patrols from both sides, resistance fighters, messengers on foot, sometimes entire units crossing at night with their boots wrapped to muffle the sound. And in the middle of that field, there was a chair, not a bench, not a log, a chair, wooden, high-backed, with arms and a slight curve worn into the seat. It faced east, not toward the road, or the path, or the village, just toward the rising sun, always. The soldiers noticed it, of course, first with suspicion, then curiosity. Some stopped to inspect it. They checked for explosives, for markings, for tricks. But it was just a chair, old, sturdy, set neatly in place, as though someone had planned to sit and simply wait. The local farmers didn't claim it. The older ones shrugged and said it had been there for months, maybe longer. Some said it belonged to a shepherd. Others believed it was part of a memorial, though no one remembered who or what it might be honouring. The truth was, no one knew. But the chair stayed. Each morning, it had shifted slightly, always facing the same direction, always realigned to catch the very first rays of the sun. Some said the wind did it. Others believed someone returned each night to adjust it, just a little. But no one ever saw them. Over time, it became a kind of legend. Soldiers began to sit in it, one at a time, never for long. Some said it brought dreams. Others said it made you think of home. It didn't matter what uniform you wore. The chair didn't ask. For just a few minutes, it became a place to be still, to look east, to imagine something else. Once, during a lull between advances, 2 soldiers from opposite sides arrived at the field from different directions. They saw each other, rifles raised, then noticed the chair between them. Neither moved. The wind passed. The moment held. And slowly, wordlessly, both men stepped back into the trees. After the war, most who'd passed through forgot the field. The fences were rebuilt, the roads widened, but the chair remained. Years later, a veteran returned to the region. He had served nearby and never spoke much about what he'd seen. But he asked to find one place, the field with the chair. The locals helped him search. The chair was no longer there. Time had taken it, but the spot was easy to find. The grass grew thinner where it once stood, a circle worn soft by memory. He brought a small wooden plaque with him, nailed it to a post near the edge of the field. It read, "To the one who waited for something better." And that was all. No one knows who first placed the chair, or who kept turning it to face the dawn. Maybe it was just one person waiting for someone who never came. Or maybe it was many, each quietly hoping, each quietly remembering. But the truth is, it didn't need a name. It didn't need a story. It just needed to be there. Because sometimes, in the middle of everything falling apart, you need to know there's still a place where you can sit, face the sun, and believe that something better might still come. The mirror left behind. War takes many things. It takes lives. It takes time. It takes the feeling of safety, the sound of ordinary mornings. But sometimes, it also leaves things behind. Small things. Objects that don't make headlines. Things that sit quietly in corners and remember what people forget. This is the story of one such thing. A mirror. It hung just inside the front door of an apartment building in Berlin. The kind of mirror every home once had. Simple, rectangular, trimmed with dark wood, hung just high enough to catch your face before leaving. The hallway it watched over was narrow, with cracked tiles and a stairwell that groaned in winter. Families lived on every floor. The walls held laughter once, then whispers, then silence. The war crept in slowly at first, like a draft beneath the door. Names disappeared from mailboxes. The baker's boy stopped coming. Then the sirens started. Then the windows were taped. Then came the knocking no one wanted to hear. And still, the mirror stayed. One by one, the apartments emptied. Some left by choice. Some by orders. Some were never seen again. And each time, as they walked out for the last time, the mirror caught their reflection. Not fully, just a glance, a shoulder, the tilt of a hat, the way someone adjusted their collar, even when they had no idea where they were going. No one spoke to the mirror. No one thought to. Until one day, someone did. No one knows exactly who it was. A woman, they think. Based on the height of the writing, the careful curve of the letters. She must have stayed behind longer than most. And before she left, whether by train or truck or something worse, she reached up to the foggy glass and etched 5 small words with the tip of her finger. Remember me smiling, just once. They were barely visible, scratched softly into the condensation, later traced again with something sharper. It wasn't a demand. It wasn't even a request. Just a hope, a trace of something human, left in a place meant to forget. The building stood through the worst of the bombing. Damaged, yes. Shaken, windows broken. But the walls held. And so did the mirror. When Allied forces entered the city, soldiers swept through abandoned buildings to check for threats, for wounded, for records. One soldier, American, young, tired, stepped into the hallway and saw the mirror. He paused. He looked into it, and he saw the words. Faint, fragile, still there. He didn't say anything. He just reached out, gently touched the glass, and stood still for a long time. Later, when the building was cleared, he returned. He took down the mirror, carefully, almost reverently, and carried it with him all the way home. Not because he knew who had written the words, not because he thought he could answer them, but because it felt wrong to leave them behind. He hung the mirror in his hallway, in a house in Maine. He never told the full story, only that it had come from Berlin, that it had once belonged to someone who wanted to be remembered with a smile. And even now, decades later, visitors sometimes ask about it. Something about the way the light catches in its corners. Something about the way it reflects more than just your face. Who's the woman in the glass? They ask. And there is never an answer, just a silence that says, she was here. She looked once, and she wanted to be remembered kindly. Because in a time when faces vanished and names were erased, someone reached out through a mirror and said, I was human, and once, just once, I smiled. The teacups at the border. Near the border of Switzerland, just beyond the reach of occupied France, where the woods grow dense and the paths narrow to little more than deer trails, there was a cottage, small, weather-worn, nestled between trees that leaned in as if to protect it. It didn't look like much, not a safe house, not a checkpoint, just an old stone structure with a sloping roof and thin white curtains that never moved. But inside that cottage, a woman waited. She had no uniform, no title. She wasn't part of the resistance, at least not in any official sense. Her name was Marta, and she had lived there her whole life. Before the war, she sold eggs to neighbours and kept a garden filled with mint and lavender. During the war, she made tea. That was her ritual. Each evening, just before dusk, Marta would set a table beside the back door. A small wooden table with uneven legs. She covered it with a clean cloth, always the same one, embroidered long ago by her mother. Then she placed 4 teacups, one at each corner, and poured hot water into each. Steam curled softly into the mountain air. Sometimes she had sugar, sometimes not, but always she brewed the tea. The cups stayed warm for a while. She never rushed, and most evenings, no one came. But some evenings, someone did. A child, shivering and wide-eyed, clutching a paper bag. A man limping, with mud on his coat and silence in his eyes. A woman with 2 children and no shoes. Marta never asked their names. She never asked where they were from or where they were going. She simply pulled out a chair, offered a cup, and waited. Sometimes they stayed only a moment, just long enough to sip, to breathe, to remember what warmth tasted like. Other times, they lingered, and when they did, Marta offered more than tea. A blanket, a piece of bread, a map sketched in flour on her kitchen table. Directions to the nearest crossing point, always changing, always quiet. Then she would open her door and let them pass through. Into Switzerland, into something better. She never kept records, never counted how many came, but the teacups told the story. Some chipped, some cracked, some never returned, and each morning she cleaned them carefully, set them aside, prepared again for evening. The local guards knew of her perhaps, but she was old, harmless, they thought, a woman who talked to herself and brewed tea for no one, and so they left her alone. After the war, a soldier turned cartographer visited the region. He had heard stories, vague mentions of a woman with teacups, of a table that glowed in the dusk. He found the cottage, abandoned now. Marta was gone, but the table remained. And inside, in a cupboard by the stove, he found the cups, 12 of them, each carefully wrapped in cloth, each holding the shape of a hand that had once held it, long enough to feel human again. He took one with him, not to keep, but to place in a museum, not behind glass, but in the center of a room filled with letters, maps, and shoes. It sat there quietly, no plaque, just a teacup, warm only in memory. And still visitors stop. They ask, "What is this?" And the answer is always the same. This is how someone said, "You are safe, you are seen." And for the next few minutes, you are home. The quilt that mapped escape. In a rural corner of Belgium, tucked between farmlands and forests, there was a barn with drafty walls and a roof that creaked when the wind passed through just right. It sat back from the road, easy to overlook, and during the war, that was the point. No one lingered near it unless they had to. But those who did, who entered quietly through the side door just before dusk, knew that this place held something more than hay and tools. It held direction, and hope, and a quilt. The women who worked in the barn were farmers' wives, mostly. Grandmothers, seamstresses, women whose husbands had gone missing or to war, and who now spent their days tending animals, feeding children, and pretending nothing had changed. But everything had, especially for those who came through in the night, downed pilots, lost scouts, resistance couriers with the wrong papers and not enough time. They arrived tired, dirty, quiet, and always uncertain which way to go next. That's where the quilt came in. It hung along the back wall of the barn, stretched neatly between 2 posts, always visible, always appearing perfectly ordinary. A patchwork of flowers, birds, riverbanks. Nothing unusual, nothing bold. But that was the brilliance of it, because hidden in the pattern was something far more detailed than decoration. It was a map. Each square meant something. The green vine curling from left to right. That was the river Meuse. The pale blue bird at the corner, a symbol that the border was close. The marigold blossoms with 5 petals pointed the direction to a safe house. Each flower, each colour, each stitch carried meaning. And if you knew how to read it, the quilt wasn't just a blanket, it was a guide. The women had sewn it slowly, over months, using scraps from worn clothes, old tablecloths, whatever fabric could be spared. They spoke in code while they worked. One would say, "That yellow's too bright for spring," meaning the signal was too obvious. Another might suggest, "The stem should be longer," which meant the root needed adjusting. They worked by candlelight, while children slept upstairs and boots marched outside their window. No one outside their circle knew what the quilt truly was. not even all the men who passed through. Some were simply told, "Count the red blossoms, then walk south." Others were pointed to the corner where a particular shape waited, and from that they understood where to go next. It was enough to move, enough to survive. They changed the quilt as needed, adding new pieces, shifting old ones, altering the shape so that it was never exactly the same twice. And when the war pressed closer, when danger grew near, they folded it, hid it, buried it beneath hay, or tucked it behind the false wall near the grain sacks. But it always came back out, because someone always needed it. After liberation, the barn stood empty for a while. People moved on. The quilt was taken down, folded neatly, and placed in a chest, forgotten maybe, or maybe just resting. Years later, a man returned, older now, slower. He had been a young pilot once, lost behind enemy lines, led by strangers who risked everything. He had spent one night in that barn, one, just long enough to be handed a biscuit, to be pointed toward a square with stitched blue lines, and told, "Follow that." He did, and he lived. He asked about the quilt. "Is it still here?" The farmer's daughter, now grown, opened the chest. It was frayed, yes, some stitches loose, but the path was still there, the map, still sewn in silence. Today, that quilt hangs in a museum. It looks like art, a beautiful piece of wartime handiwork. But those who know, they understand. It is not just fabric. It is every step someone took toward freedom, one square at a time. The girl who drew light bulbs. In the city of Warsaw, beneath a building shattered by war and weather, there was a basement. It had once been storage, dusty boxes, laundry lines, a bicycle or two. But after the bombings, after the soldiers came and the lights went out for good, it became something else. A shelter, not marked, not official, just a place where people gathered in silence, families, strangers, anyone who had nowhere else to go. It was dark, always dark. Even in the daytime, the windows had long since been bricked up. The only light came from candles, and even those were rationed. Matches were hoarded like gold. The air was heavy, and the ceiling low, and every sound seemed louder than it should be. Footsteps, whispers, breaths. And that is where Anya lived, 8 years old. Thin. Hair always pulled back in a messy braid. Her father had once been a teacher. Her mother had once played piano in the evenings, the kind of music that made you pause, even if you didn't know the notes. But now, both were gone. Anya stayed with a neighbor who had lost his own daughter. They didn't speak much. There wasn't much to say. Most days passed in stillness, waiting, listening, hoping. But one afternoon, Anya found a piece of charcoal. It had rolled from the remnants of a fire upstairs, just a nub, barely larger than her thumb. She tucked it into her pocket and kept it there, not for warmth, for something else. That night, while the others rested, eyes closed but not asleep, Anya moved to the far wall of the shelter, and she began to draw. She didn't draw trees, or birds, or faces. She drew light bulbs, just one at first, then two, then dozens, round and oblong, hanging from wires, glowing in the dark, some with switches, some with cords curling down to the floor. She didn't ask, she didn't explain. She just filled the wall with them, quietly, carefully, each one drawn as if she remembered exactly how it should shine. The others watched. No one stopped her. Someone gave her another bit of charcoal. A woman offered the end of a pencil, and Anya kept drawing, night after night. When space ran out on one wall, she moved to another. Always bulbs, always light. When asked why, on the rare days someone found the words to ask anything, Anya shrugged. "I don't want us to forget," she said, "what it looked like when the light was on." And so the shelter changed. Just a little. The walls became windows into memory, into something beyond the war. And though the bulbs didn't glow, they gave off something else, a sense of place, of care, of remembering what might someday return. Then, after months in that dark room, the electricity came back, just briefly. A flicker, a hum. A single bulb strung overhead buzzed to life. It didn't last long, maybe an hour, but it was enough for the people in the shelter to look up, and then around, and see her drawings illuminated, light bulbs drawn in darkness, now glowing beside real ones. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They just looked, and they saw what they had forgotten they'd missed. After the war, the building was rebuilt, the shelter sealed, but the drawings, somehow, remained. A few sections of wall were preserved. They now sit in a small museum tucked into the edge of Warsaw. Charcoal sketches, faint but present. Light bulbs, drawn by a child who understood what hope looked like, even when it couldn't be touched. Because sometimes the smallest hands carry the clearest vision. And even when the world goes dark, someone always remembers where the switch used to be, the dog who guarded the library. In a small village in Ukraine, where winter arrives early and stays until the bones of spring begin to creak, there once stood a library. Not a grand one, not a marble columned kind with gilded signs or velvet chairs, just a single room, half wood and half stone, with shelves built by hand and windows that let in more dust than sunlight. It sat beside the town square, next to a market stall that hadn't opened in months. By the time the war reached them, the library had already lost half its books. Some were burned when the first soldiers came. Others were stolen, used for warmth, or worse, as blank paper for reports that no one wanted to write. The librarian was taken too. No one ever said why. And after that, the library stood hollow, its door crooked, its shelves leaning forward as if they too were tired. But one thing remained: a dog. No one knew where he came from. He wasn't there before the war. Not that anyone remembered. But one day, in the middle of the winter, when the windows had all shattered and the wind slipped through like a thief, the dog appeared. Black fur, pointed ears, a slow walk that showed he didn't trust quickly. He sat on the library steps and didn't leave. At first, people ignored him. There were more urgent things to worry about: food, heat, news from the front. But the dog stayed. Rain, snow, shelling in the distance, always there. If someone approached the library door, he stood. Not aggressive, not barking, just present, watching. Then one morning, a child came to the door, a boy, maybe 10, wrapped in a coat 2 sizes too big. He reached for the handle, and the dog let him pass. No growl, no movement, just a quiet understanding. The boy stayed inside for a long time. When he came out, he held a book. Nothing valuable, the spine was broken, the cover half missing. But he held it like treasure. That's when the others began to come. One by one, children from the village made their way to the broken building. Some were barefoot, some carried candles, some just came to sit. The books were scattered but still readable. History, poetry, a few novels that had somehow survived every hand that had touched them. And the dog, they named him Kniga, which means book, stayed by the door. He never followed anyone home, never wandered the streets. His place was there, beside the threshold. If soldiers came too close, he growled. If someone tried to break the glass, he barked. But to the children, he was silent, protective, constant. People began to leave food for him. Scraps, bits of crust. A scarf was tied around his neck in winter. Someone even mended the corner of the library roof, just enough to keep the snow out of the back room, and still Kniga kept watch. He stayed for 2 years. When the war ended and people returned, rebuilding slowly, the new librarian arrived with a box of donated books and found the dog still there. Grey now, slower, but still watching the door. She let him stay, gave him a cushion behind the desk, and when he passed, peacefully, one summer evening with the windows open and children reading nearby, she placed a plaque outside. It read, "Guarded by Niga, Nitten für Tito, till Nitten Fire, protector of pages, friend to readers, good boy." And now, even in peace, when students open that same door, they step just a little more gently. Not because they're afraid, but because they remember that once, in the hardest of years, a dog stood watch over stories and kept the light on for anyone brave enough to keep reading. The Man in the Hat. In wartime Paris, even the smallest acts became significant. A loaf of bread, a kind word, a shared glance across a room where people no longer spoke freely. All of them, tiny sparks against a sky that had grown grey with fear. The city still looked beautiful, in its own wounded way, but the light had changed. It had shifted. Dusk came sooner. People walked faster. And hope, well, it had learned to be quiet. But every Sunday, without fail, a man in a tall black hat walked the streets. No one knew his name. Not really. He appeared just after morning mass, moving at the same slow, steady pace, always from the same alley near Rue des Martyrs. He wore a dark coat, neat but worn. Gloves, even in spring. And over one arm he carried 2 loaves of bread, long, golden, wrapped in cloth, steam sometimes rising gently from their folds. One for each hand. He never spoke, never called out. He simply walked. And then, somewhere along his route, never the same place twice, he would stop. Sometimes at a corner, sometimes near a bus stop, once beside a playground missing its laughter. He would look around, nod politely, and offer one of the loaves to a stranger. It was always a different person, a woman holding a child, a man in uniform, a boy with torn shoes, whoever stood nearest. He'd hand it to them gently, tip his hat, a deep, precise tilt, as if offering thanks for the honor, and then walk away. That was it. No announcement, no reason, just a loaf, a gesture. The bread was always warm. Children began to wait for him. Not crowding, not calling, just waiting. They'd sit on the steps and whisper guesses about who would receive the bread that week. Some said he was a priest in hiding. Others believed he'd once been a baker, or perhaps an artist who'd lost his words. A few insisted he was a ghost, the kind that returned only to do one kind thing over and over again. It didn't matter, because in a time when people had learned to stop expecting anything good from the world, here was this man, with his hat and his silence, and his bread. He walked for over a year. Then one Sunday, he didn't come. The children waited until noon, then past lunch. The corner where he often paused remained empty. The street, unusually quiet. The next week, he still didn't appear. No one knew what had happened. Perhaps he had been caught, or grown too weak, or simply disappeared, the way so many did during those years. But the city noticed. You could feel it in the way people looked at the space he used to fill, not with sound, not with speeches, but with something much heavier. Kindness. And then, one afternoon, someone left something on a bench where he'd often stopped. A single loaf of bread, wrapped in cloth, and a small paper hat. It stayed there all day. No one touched it. No one needed to. Because the message was already clear. Not all heroes carry weapons. Some carry warmth, and walk quietly, and tip their hat, as if to say, "Here, take this. It's not much, but it's enough to remind you. You are not forgotten." The tunnel beneath the bell tower. In a village in northern France, where the stones of the buildings had grown soft with age, and the rooftops leaned into one another like neighbors in conversation, there stood a bell tower, tall, slender, and seemingly untouched by the chaos that had cracked open the world. The tower rose above a church that had lost most of its windows. The pews inside were broken, the altar chipped. But the bell still hung in place, quiet most of the time, except at 6 p.m. every evening when it rang once, just once. The sound echoed across the empty streets, past boarded shops and shuttered homes, and then faded. It didn't mark the hour. Not really. Everyone had lost track of time by then, and yet every evening it rang. The villagers had grown used to it. Those who remained anyway. Many had left, scattered by occupation, fear, hunger, but some stayed, and those who did began to notice something odd. No matter how close the war came, the bell tower remained untouched. Bombs fell nearby, planes passed overhead, buildings collapsed on either side of the village square, but the tower stood. No cracks, no soot, no mark of violence. What no one knew, or at least what only a few knew, was what lay beneath it. It had begun early in the war, when the occupation turned from presence to pressure. When neighbours began disappearing and questions became dangerous. The local priest, an old man named Père Martin, had discovered something unusual beneath the altar, a loose tile which led to a trap door. Beneath it was a narrow passage, carved long ago, perhaps during the revolutions, or maybe even before. It led under the church, through cold, narrow stone, into a space just big enough for people to hide. And so they did. One by one, the vulnerable were led there. A child separated from her parents, a wounded resistance courier, a Jewish family with forged documents and shaking hands. They were brought through the side entrance, never the front, at night, always in silence. The trap door opened, and they slipped into the dark. The tunnel led them to a chamber beneath the bell itself, a space deep enough to muffle breath, dry enough to store hope. It wasn't comfortable, but it was safe. And every day they waited. They had one signal, the bell. If it rang once at 6 p.m., it meant it was safe, at least for now. They could step out, stretch, speak, eat. And if it didn't ring, they waited longer. Père Martin rang it himself, even when there was shelling nearby, even when his knees ached and the tower steps felt endless. He rang it because people needed to hear it, not just those underground, but those in the village who had started using it as a measure of survival. The bell meant someone was still alive, someone still cared. Over time, the space beneath the tower held more than people. It held drawings, stories etched into the stone by children, a list of names, carved slowly with the edge of a spoon. There was a prayer written in 4 languages on the back of a hymn book. Someone had stitched a cloth banner that simply read, "Still here." When the war finally ended and the bells across France rang freely again, this one rang too. But this time, 7 times in a row. The villagers gathered beneath it. The trapdoor was opened, and the people stepped out into the light, blinking, thin, but alive. Years later, the bell tower still stands, now officially preserved, not for its architecture, but for what it hid. And each year, on the anniversary of the last air raid, a single chime still rings out at 6 p.m. sharp, not to mark time, but to remind us that even underground, in the quietest dark, hope can still wait and still rise. The Whispering Field. In the Netherlands, not far from the coast, there is a field that looks like any other. Wide, flat, golden in the right season. It bends gently in the wind, rippling like water when the breeze moves through. If you didn't know better, you'd think it was ordinary. But it isn't. Not really. The locals call it the Whispering Field. And during the war, that name meant more than poetry. It was a rye field then, carefully tended, part of a patchwork of farms that fed the nearby village. The soil was good, the seasons kind, but the people, well, they were learning to speak less. The occupation made sure of that. Soldiers came and went. Patrols passed along the dirt road beside the field. They never stopped for long, just watched, took notes, counted faces. And so, the villagers adapted. They worked quietly, and the field became more than a place to grow food. It became a place to share secrets. Not in letters, not in codes, in conversation. Every summer, when the harvest neared, the workers, men, women, and even children, walked between the rows and talked as they worked. But what they said wasn't always what it seemed. "The rye is ripe," one would say, which meant someone had gone missing. "We'll thresh early this year," another might reply. That meant a raid was coming. "Wheat bends low," they'd say, and that meant stay inside tonight. To any outsider, it sounded like farmers talking about grain and weather. But those whispers, scattered like seed between rows, carried far. Messages passed hand to hand, story to story, between bending stalks and careful glances. Once, a young boy delivered a warning by walking the field and loudly wondering if the poppies were late again. That was code. It meant the resistance needed to delay a pickup. He didn't know what it meant, not fully, just that he was supposed to say it loud enough for someone else to hear. He did, and the right person heard, and something terrible was quietly avoided. The field never stopped working. Crops were harvested, bread was baked, but every whisper was a thread, and together they held something much larger in place, something invisible but strong, the kind of strength that grows when voices choose survival over silence. When the war ended, the whispers stopped, at least the kind that needed hiding. But the field remained, and so did the habit. Even today, farmers still talk softly as they work. Sometimes just to themselves, sometimes just to the wind. But every so often, an old phrase slips through. "The rye is ripe," someone might say. Or, "The wheat bends low." And whoever hears it will smile, not because there's danger now, but because there once was. And they got through it. No signs mark the field, no plaques or fences or monuments, just grass and sky and wind. But if you walk it in the late afternoon and close your eyes, you might hear it, the quiet way voices move when truth hides inside them. Because even in war, some things still grow. And even when watched, some people still find a way to speak, softly, safely. Together, the church with no doors. Just outside Rome, in a town where the stone roads curled between olive trees and the buildings leaned close like old friends, there stood a church. Small, modest. Nothing like the grand cathedrals tourists travelled to see. This one sat at the end of a quiet street, its steeple just tall enough to be seen above the roofs, its bells rusted, its walls warmed by the sun. When the war came, the street changed. Doors shut tighter. Voices softened. And one day, soldiers came and chained the doors of the church closed, padlocks thick and cold. The windows were boarded, the notices removed. It was declared non-essential and sealed. And yet people still gathered near it, not to enter, they couldn't, but to look, to stand in silence, to remember what it had once meant: births, weddings, music, meals, and above all, safety. Weeks passed, then months, then years. The church became part of the background, boarded, hollow, fading. Until after the war, someone finally returned to open it. They brought tools, crowbars, fresh hinges. They unchained the front door expecting dust and decay. But when the light broke in, soft and angled through the cracks, what they found inside was something else entirely. Chairs arranged neatly, candles burned low. A wooden cross, lovingly polished. Flowers, fresh ones, and faint footprints across the stone floor. The church hadn't been abandoned. It had been used, not through the front, not through the doors, but from below. Beneath the altar, hidden behind a loose panel, was a narrow stairwell, winding down into the earth. A crypt, technically, but not a tomb. Not anymore. People had entered through the catacombs, a web of tunnels beneath the town, once used by monks, long forgotten by most. They came in silence, carrying babies, carrying bread, carrying songs that couldn't be sung aloud. And there, in the undercroft, they continued. Weddings were whispered. rings passed in candlelight. Baptisms done with gathered rainwater, caught in old bowls. Children were taught hymns by memory. No books, just voices. And sometimes, when the wind was still and the world above quieted, they played music. Violins made from scrapwood, a flute carved from bone. Their melodies too soft to reach the surface, but strong enough to reach each other. No one ever spoke of it during the war. No one had to. They knew what it meant, that even with no doors, no permission, no light, the church remained. Faith in its simplest form. When the truth came out, no one was punished. The war had ended. The soldiers had moved on. The priest who led the services never claimed heroism. We prayed, he said, and we waited. Today, that church stands with its doors wide open. There is light now, and singing, and names written in the guest book at the back. But if you look carefully, just beneath the altar, you'll see a small brass plate that reads, "This door was never locked," because some places can be sealed, but never closed, and some spirits, no matter how deep they are hidden, will always find a way to rise. The tailor of the tracks. Near the border of Hungary, where the train lines braid through empty fields and vanish into wooded hills, there was a station. Not a large one, just a platform, a signal house, and the sharp smell of coal in the air. The kind of place where movement never stopped, but no one stayed long enough to learn names. And beside that station, in a small wooden shack built from railway planks and tin, worked a tailor. He was not young. His hands were slow, his back bent, but his needle never trembled. People called him Bela. That's all, no last name. Just Bela the tailor. He patched sleeves, mended buttons, let out hems when a child had outgrown their only coat. Most who passed through barely noticed him, a figure in the corner, thread in his teeth, head bowed, quiet. But Bela listened to everything. The station, during those years, was no longer just a place to catch a train. It became a place of decisions. Families boarding cars they didn't understand, soldiers checking lists, whispers in languages the guards didn't bother to learn. And in the middle of it all, Bela sat at his table, stitching, watching. No one knew exactly when it started. Maybe after he overheard a conversation. Maybe after he saw the wrong child step into the wrong car. But slowly, carefully, Bela began to sew messages into the clothes he repaired. Not notes, not words, just thread. Thread that was slightly too red, a seam that curved instead of straightened. A symbol hidden in the inside of a cuff. They meant things. Avoid the third car. Pass this jacket to the girl with braids. Wait until the bend in the tracks. Then run. At first, he did it alone, but then others began to help. A station clerk who slowed trains just long enough. A baker's boy who handed off parcels wrapped in cloth. A conductor who blinked once for yes, twice for no. No one ever spoke about what they were doing. Not directly, but they knew. People began asking for Bela, quietly. They'd pretend to need a torn sleeve fixed or a pocket added, and while he worked, he'd nod, just slightly. If it was safe, if it was not, if they needed to move or wait. He never asked names, never made promises. Just stitched what he could and hoped the threads would hold. Once, a woman left her scarf behind, pale blue, with a thin gold stripe Bela had added to its edge. Months later, that same scarf reappeared on another woman's neck, at another station, in another country. It had travelled farther than he ever would. A trail of thread, a trail of survival. He kept working, even when the trains screamed louder, even when the guards grew crueler. He never left his shack, never looked away, just sewed, steady and silent, while the world tried to unravel around him. When the war ended, the station quieted. The trains changed, and one day, Bela's shop was empty. He had vanished. No one knew where to. No records, no grave, just stories. A handful of coats, preserved by those who had lived because of them. A button stitched in the shape of a V. A hem that marked a date, hidden in folds no soldier ever searched. And in a museum in Budapest, there's a single jacket on display. Patched at the elbows, threadbare at the collar. Inside, beneath the lining, stitched in red thread no longer bright, are 3 simple lines. One curves left, one curves right. The last one stops. They say it meant, this is the moment, go. Because sometimes resistance wears no uniform, sometimes it carries no weapon. Just a needle, a spool of thread, and the courage to sew when no one's watching. The chalk circle. In the heart of Prague, tucked between shuttered homes and buildings bruised by war, there was a school. Not a large one, just 2 classrooms, a courtyard, and a bell that hadn't rung in months. The windows were boarded, the doors locked from the outside, but somehow, classes still happened. Not formally, not loudly, but still. The children arrived quietly each morning, not all at once, in pairs, alone, walking with the kind of careful rhythm that made them invisible. They slipped through the back gate, pressed against the stone wall, and entered the courtyard, where a woman stood waiting. Her name was Miss Horakova. She had taught there before the war. Literature mostly. Stories and poems and the kind of questions that made young minds stretch. When the soldiers came and the rules changed, she stayed. She had no family to flee with, no reason to leave, only the children. And that, for her, was enough. She couldn't teach inside anymore. The classrooms were locked, cold, and watched. But the courtyard, open to the sky and covered in shadow until noon, was still theirs. And so, one morning, she took a stick of chalk from her coat pocket, walked to the center of the courtyard, and bent down. She drew a circle. Not a perfect one. The stone was cracked. Her hands were stiff. But she made it as round as she could. Then she stood up, looked at the children, and said very softly, "Inside this circle, you are safe. While we are here, no one can take that away." The children said nothing, just nodded, and one by one they stepped inside. They sat cross-legged in the cold, pulled coats tight, shared pencils. Sometimes they read from scraps of paper passed down over weeks. Sometimes Miss Horakova recited stories from memory, fairy tales, fables, myths that felt too big for that small space, but fit perfectly in their eyes. Rain fell. Bombs echoed in the distance. But still, each day she came, and each day she redrew the circle. If it faded, she traced it again. If the wind blew it off the stones, she waited until the children arrived, then let them draw it with her. Sometimes the lessons were real, geography, math, even French verbs whispered between cracks in the walls. Other times they just sat and breathed and knew they were not alone. The soldiers never noticed. Or maybe they did and chose not to act. It doesn't matter. The circle held. Years passed. The war ended. The school reopened. Desks were rebuilt. Bells rang again. But the courtyard, the one with the chalk, was never paved over, even when the city changed, even when time pulled people away. Because when the building was restored, someone remembered. A student, grown now. He returned and placed a small stone marker in the courtyard. Just one sentence. This is where we stayed human. And every year, on the first day of class, the teachers draw a circle. Not because they need protection now, but because they remember what it meant to feel safe, even for a little while. Because sometimes the smallest lines can hold the greatest strength. A ring of chalk, a space of quiet, and the voice of someone who says, "You are here. You are learning, and that means you're alive." The empty jar. In a small coastal village in Greece, Nestled between winding stone alleys and lemon trees that leaned over garden walls, there was a bakery. You wouldn't have noticed it if you weren't looking. Its sign was hand-painted, its windows fogged from the heat of the oven. It smelled like flour and ash and the kind of sweetness that only comes from patience. Inside, the shelves were often empty. War had made flour scarce and sugar even more so. But the baker, a man named Andreas, still rose before dawn each day. He lit the fire, he stirred the dough, and he baked what he could, even if it was only one loaf at a time. On a shelf behind the counter sat a jar, an old honey jar. The label had faded, the lid slightly rusted, and it was always, unmistakably, empty. Customers saw it and thought nothing of it. Just an old container, maybe waiting to be reused. But it never moved, never filled. And in a time when people kept nothing that didn't have purpose, its presence was peculiar. What no one knew was that the jar held more than honey ever could. Inside, tucked beneath a false bottom Andreas had carved himself, was a folded slip of paper. Then another, and another. Each one held a name. No dates, no notes, just names, first and last, carefully written in Andreas's cramped handwriting. These were not customers. These were people he had helped. A British soldier smuggled through the village in the back of a flour cart. A woman and her 2 daughters hidden in the cellar behind the baking tins. A local priest who had spoken too loudly, too bravely, and needed to disappear for a while. Andreas kept their names not for glory, not for history, but for memory. He knew that in times like these, names could vanish, people could vanish, taken, lost, forgotten. But if he wrote them down, just once, and kept them safe, then a part of them still existed, still lived. Every time he helped someone escape, or hide, or survive, he returned to the jar. He waited until the bakery was empty. He wiped flour from his hands, and he wrote. It became a ritual, as sacred as kneading dough, as precise as measuring salt, and as dangerous as anything could be. If the jar had been found, it would have meant death for Andreas, and likely for the names inside it. But he kept it on the shelf, in plain sight. Because the best hiding place is often the one no one bothers to question. When the war ended, the jar remained. Andreas never spoke of it. He kept baking. He grew older, quieter, but the jar never moved. Even when his hands shook too much to make bread. Even when the oven grew cold. After his death, the new owners of the bakery, a young couple from Athens, found the jar while cleaning. It nearly fell, but the lid clinked open, and inside, paper. Dozens of slips, names no one recognized, but each one carefully folded, protected. They didn't throw them away. They asked, they learned. And then they placed the jar on a small pedestal by the window, beside a basket of warm rolls. There's a plaque now, carved into olive wood. The jar was empty, but it was full of lives. Because sometimes remembering is resistance, and writing a name is a way to say you mattered, you were here. And I didn't let the world forget you. The boat that never left. In a quiet village along a Norwegian fjord, where the water is still enough to mirror the sky and the mountains seem close enough to touch, there was a boat that never left the dock. It was small, modest. A fishing vessel built for cold mornings and rough hands. Its paint had faded. The name on its side, Svanen, had chipped until it was barely legible. Locals passed it daily. Children played around its ropes. Tourists took photos. But during the war, people began to wonder, why didn't it move? The other boats came and went. Even under occupation, fishing was allowed, limited, watched, but permitted. Boats were lifelines here, but Svanen remained tied to its post, always moored, always ready, and never used. Its owner, a man named Emil, was older than most, grey-bearded, quiet, the kind of man who didn't speak unless the silence asked him to. He was a fisherman before the war, and yet now he never cast a net. When asked, he'd simply say, "The engine's gone. No use taking her out." And people accepted that. They had other worries, other shadows to follow. One less boat wasn't a tragedy, but the truth was, the engine wasn't broken. It was maintained weekly, oiled, tuned, the hull scrubbed by moonlight, the fuel carefully stored, hidden in barrels beneath floorboards in Emil's shed. The boat wasn't forgotten. It was waiting. Each night, long after the town had settled into the kind of sleep that only fear can produce, Emil would check the ropes, adjust the lines, make sure the supplies were still there, blankets, water, bread wrapped in wax paper, a compass, a flashlight with spare batteries, and under a loose plank near the rudder, a folded map marked with a single line, across the fjord, then east, then into Sweden. The boat wasn't meant for fishing. It was meant for fleeing. Emil had watched too many disappear, friends, neighbours, families he used to greet in the market. One by one, they were taken. And so, without orders, without being asked, he prepared. He didn't advertise, didn't spread word. He just waited. And when someone knocked, not loudly, just once at the back door of his cottage, he'd nod, say nothing, and lead them in darkness to the boat that everyone believed was broken. Over time, Svanen made that trip 17 times, 17 nights, 17 crossings, in silence, under stars, through fog thick enough to hide the wake, no lights, no noise, just Emil at the helm, hands steady, eyes fixed on the distant shore. He never asked names, he never took thanks, and as soon as he returned, he tied the boat up in its usual place, made sure it looked forgotten, made sure no one suspected. And somehow they didn't. When the war ended, people found out. Not through him. He never told the story, but through the ones who'd crossed, the ones who survived, who remembered the boat with the faded name and the man with the steady hands. They offered to restore it, paint it, frame it in memory. But Emil said no. He asked only that it remain where it had always been, quiet, untouched, because not everything brave needs to be displayed. Some things, he believed, do their best work when they are mistaken for ordinary. Today, Svanen still rests in the same place. Ropes tied, engine silent. But beneath the deck, a plaque has been added. Small, brass, and almost invisible unless you know to look for it. It reads, "She left 17 times. She returned 17 times. She was never broken." Because sometimes what stays still the longest is the thing that carries us furthest. When the moment comes, the soap maker's signal. In a small German town near the edge of the Black Forest, where the rooftops tilt steeply and the chimneys puff quietly through winter, there was a shop with a blue door. A modest place, not a market, not a bakery, just a single room with a worn counter, wooden shelves, and rows of hand-shaped soaps. The man who ran the shop was called Joseph. He had made soap his whole life, not industrial bars, not the kind wrapped in bright paper and sold in bulk, but careful, simple shapes moulded with oils, herbs, and the kind of patience that can only come from someone who likes working with their hands. Each bar was a little different. Some were round, some square. Some carried scents of lavender, rosemary, or citrus, when such things could still be found. Others were plain. He lined them up in the window, rows of colours against the grey world outside. Rose pink, lemon yellow, sky blue, lavender purple. To most who passed, it was just a soap shop. But to those who listened, really listened, it was a signal tower. Because Joseph didn't choose the colours at random, he changed them with purpose. Red, yellow, blue, purple, each had meaning. Not to soldiers, not to strangers, but to those who needed to know where to go, when to hide, who to trust. When the soaps in the window were all yellow, it meant the Gestapo was in town. When they were blue, It meant the local safe house was open, but only for that night. Purple. Purple meant danger. A raid was planned. Someone had been taken. It was time to disappear. There was no key, no chart, no written guide. Only word of mouth, passed quietly through kitchens, workshops, bakeries. "Check the soap window," they'd say. "Joseph knows." No one ever saw him speak it aloud. He barely said a word at all. Just opened his door each morning, arranged the bars in perfect alignment, and stood behind the counter with a cloth in his hands. People began to come not for soap, though they always bought a bar or two, but for the knowledge. Joseph never looked up when someone entered. But if they paused a moment too long by the window, if they tapped their coin twice on the counter, he would glance at them just once, a nod. That was enough. One evening, a stranger came, a woman with 2 children, coats dusted in train soot, eyes too alert for someone just arriving. She stared at the display. All the bars were rose pink that day. She waited, then turned to go. Joseph reached beneath the counter and handed her a wrapped package. "For the road," he said. His only words that week. Inside, among the soap, was a slip of paper. 3 words, handwritten. "Go north. Tonight." She did, and she lived. By the war's end, dozens owed their lives to Joseph's silent palette. He never claimed it, never told his story. After liberation, he removed the window display entirely, said it was time to go back to neutral colours. "Just soap," he'd say. Nothing more. But of course, it had never been just soap. Years later, the shop became a museum, the original shelves preserved, the blue door restored. And in the front window, someone placed 4 soap bars, replicas, shaped exactly like his. Red, blue, yellow, purple. No plaque explained them, because those who needed to understand already did. And the rest? They were never supposed to. Because sometimes survival speaks not through sound or words, but through colour, through presence, through something so ordinary no one thinks to question it. The sunflowers at the station. In the south of France, where the heat gathers gently in the folds of the hills and the cicadas hum through fields of wheat, there is a train station. It hasn't run trains in many years. Its tracks are rusted, its platform worn smooth by time and footsteps now forgotten. But there is something else there, something that still blooms. Sunflowers, dozens of them, tall, wild, unplanted, their stalks thick with resilience, their golden heads tilted always toward the morning. They grow where the gravel ends, where the grass splits, where no one expects beauty anymore. And they've been doing it for decades. It began during the war. The station had become a place of departure, not for journeys planned, not for destinations chosen. Trains came and people were loaded aboard. Some cried, some did not. They carried what they could, or nothing at all, and those left behind could only watch. One morning, a sunflower bloomed by the platform edge. No one planted it, no gardener knelt in the soil. It simply appeared, as if the ground had decided it could no longer hold only sorrow. People noticed. They passed it in silence. Some touched its petals. Some nodded as they walked by. One child drew it in charcoal on the side of the station wall. Another left a pebble beneath it. A third tied a note to its stalk with a strip of fabric torn from a sleeve. No words on the note, just a name. Soon, more sunflowers grew, and more notes followed. Not openly, not during the day, but at night, in the quiet moments between curfew and dawn. A name left beneath a leaf, a prayer pressed into the dirt, a scrap of paper with the outline of a hand drawn in pencil, a child's hand, a brother's, a lover's. By the end of the war, the space beneath those flowers was layered with memory. When the station finally emptied, when the trains stopped coming and the silence returned, the people returned too. slowly. And when they did, they tended the sunflowers. Not like a garden, but like a grave. They watered them, cleared weeds, read the notes that had survived wind and time, and each year more grew. Today, the station is quiet again. Trains pass on new tracks, life has rerouted, but the sunflowers remain, and so do the offerings. A ribbon tied to a stem, a smooth stone shaped like a heart, a photo in black and white, creased at the corners, and under the tallest flower, a simple wooden sign. We remember where you were taken. We remember where you left us. We remember you bloomed. Because even in places meant to erase, something always finds a way to grow. Not in spite of sorrow, but because of it. Because love, once planted, always reaches toward the light, the photographer with no film. In the heart of a walled-off district in Poland, where buildings leaned heavy with grief and the streets echoed with too much silence, there walked a man with a camera around his neck. He wore a dark coat, a scarf tied twice. His shoes were scuffed, and every day, as the world inside the ghetto shifted and shrank, he moved through it slowly, pausing at corners, tilting his head, and raising the camera to his eye. Click, step, click. He never said much, just nodded. Sometimes offered a soft, "Look here," or "Just one moment." Children would stop what they were doing. Mothers would turn their faces. The elderly would lift their chins with quiet dignity. They believed he was documenting, capturing, saving something before it disappeared. But the truth was, there was no film in the camera. There hadn't been for months. The rolls were gone, used up, impossible to replace. And yet, the man continued to walk, to pause, to lift the lens as if it still mattered. Because to him, it did. He had once been a real photographer, in better years. Weddings, portraits, postcards of blooming parks and smiling couples on bridges. His fingers still remembered how to frame a shot. His eyes still knew where the light lived, even in darkness. But the war had taken everything, his studio, his clients, his family. All that remained was the camera. So he used it, not to preserve light on film, but to preserve dignity in people. He made them feel seen, and in a place where invisibility had become survival, that mattered more than most things. The children loved him. They called him Pan Obiektiu, Mr. Lens. They'd chase after him, laughing, holding up fingers in mock poses. He would lift the camera, nod solemnly, and click. Always with the same gentle, deliberate pause, as if each image was going into a gallery the world had not yet built. He never told anyone the camera was empty. He didn't have to. Maybe some knew, maybe some didn't care. Because what mattered was the moment, the invitation to hold still, to lift one's head, and to be worth remembering. Even if only for the sound of a shutter. One day, like so many others, he was gone. Taken. No one saw where. The camera, left behind on the steps of an old school, perfectly centered. The lens cap missing. The strap neatly folded. After the war, survivors told his story. Not of his photographs. There were none. But of the way he looked through that camera as if he still believed something good could be kept. One woman, who had been just a child then, said, "For a moment, I was not afraid. I was not hungry. I was not hidden. I was simply a girl, being photographed." Today, that camera rests behind glass in a museum. The tag reads, "Unknown Photographer, Warsaw Ghetto." It is empty still. No film, no prints, just the weight of all the faces it tried to honor. And beside it, a quote engraved in the frame. "You were here, and someone saw you." Because even when the world looks away, there is power in the lens. Even when it captures nothing, it can still reflect everything. After the quiet, we remember. You've now heard 40 stories. And maybe more than stories. Maybe echoes or shadows or flickers of something half forgotten and entirely real. Not the loud accounts, not the ones carved into textbooks or repeated in speeches, but the other ones, the quiet ones, the ones that happened behind the noise, beneath the uniforms, in kitchens, in stairwells, in glances passed between people who couldn't afford to speak. Stories of a boy who read history books by candlelight while his world unraveled outside. Of a girl who drew light bulbs on the walls of a shelter so no one would forget what brightness looked like. Of a tailor who stitched truth into hems. Of a dog who guarded a door. Of a boat that waited years to carry just the right passengers into freedom. Stories like a slow breath, held in the dark, released only when it was safe to hope again. These were not stories of orders given or battles won. They were stories of bread divided in silence, of music played where music was forbidden, of jars that stayed empty but were full of names, of someone who walked a train platform every week just to say goodbye in a way no one else could, of people who didn't have to do what they did, but did it anyway, because kindness mattered even more when the world had forgotten it. They lived in whispers, in chalk lines, in footsteps on wooden stairs, in the brief flicker of a match before it went out. They lived because someone remembered them. And tonight, you remembered them too. And now here we are, at the end of our time together. 3 hours. 40 windows into lives we rarely hear about. Maybe your eyes are already closed. Maybe your body has softened beneath the blanket, your thoughts turning slow and shapeless. Or maybe you're still here with me, resting gently in the quiet, letting these stories settle around you like falling snow, weightless, quiet, familiar. There is something powerful in simply listening, in being still long enough for the forgotten to be found again, in making room for the moments that didn't ask for anything but to be seen. It's an act of peace, to give attention to the stories that don't shout. And you've done that just by being here. You've walked through places where the light had gone out, basements, cellars, abandoned libraries, snowy borders, and in each one you found something still burning, a candle, a sunflower, a child's whisper, a note tucked into a coat. You've heard about men who stood guard not with weapons but with silence, about women who poured tea for strangers just to give them 5 minutes of warmth before a night of danger, about children who carried hope in their hands like matches they didn't know how to strike, but carried anyway. And maybe you're thinking now, what do I do with all of this? These names, these moments, these voices that pressed against history's curtain but didn't always make it through. The answer is nothing. You don't have to do anything. You don't need to remember every name. You don't need to write anything down. You've already done the most important thing. You listened. And listening is remembrance. It's the opposite of forgetting. It is choosing, quietly, gently, to let a part of someone else live on in you. And when you sleep, they rest with you. When you wake, something of them wakes too. Not loudly, just there. A presence, a knowing. If your eyes are still open, let them soften. If your thoughts are still busy, let them loosen. If your heart is still carrying the weight of the world, let it set some of it down. Just for tonight. There is no danger here. There is no hurry. Only the rhythm of your own breath, the warmth of the blanket, the stillness of the room, and the memory of voices that no longer need to shout. Because you've already heard them. Let your mind drift if it wants to. Let it wander through fields with whispering rye, along staircases worn soft by years of careful footsteps, along empty tracks now overgrown with sunflowers, through a shop window filled with soap, its colours gently shifting in the morning light. You don't need to explain this feeling, or define it, or hold on to it too tightly. It's enough just to feel it, a kind of quiet connection, across time, across war, across silence. And if you rest now, and I hope you do, rest knowing this. Somewhere, once, someone lit a candle. They placed it in their window, They left their door unlocked. They played a song no one else could hear. Not because they knew who would come, but because they hoped someone would. Tonight, that someone is you. So let the stories go. Let them drift. Let them settle like dust in still air. Let them rest. Let yourself rest. The war is over. The voices have been heard. The jar is still. The tea has cooled. The bell has rung. The wings have flown. The chalk has faded. The bread has been shared. And you are safe. You are home. Thank you for listening, for remembering, for being here. Good night.